Van Illich. Beyond Economics and Ecology. The Radical Thought of Ivan Illich. Preface by Jerry Brown, Governor of California. Edited and introduced by Sajay Samuel. Preface by Jerry Brown. Ivan Illich is not your standard intellectual. His home was not in the academy and his work forms no part of an approved curriculum. He issued no manifestos and his utterly original writings both confound and clarify as they examine one modern assumption after another. He is radical in the most fundamental sense of that word and therefore not welcome on any usual reading list. The authoritative New York Review of Books last mentioned him 30 years ago, one editor terming him too catastrophic in his thinking. The New York Times, in its 2002 obituary, dismissed his ideas as watered-down Marxism and anarchist panache. Even in death, he deeply upset the acolytes of modernity. I knew Ivan Illich and had the pleasure of enjoying many hours at his table in lively conversation with his friends in Cuernavaca, Oakland, State College, and Bremen. His gaze was piercing yet it was warm and totally embracing. His hospitality was unmatched and his aliveness and friendship well embodied his ideas that in print were so provocative and difficult. Illich was a radical because he went to the root of things. He questioned the very premises of modern life and traced its many institutional excesses to developments in the early and medieval church. In his writings, he strove to open up cracks in the certitudes of our modern worldview. He questioned speed, schools, hospitals, technology, economic growth and unlimited energy, even if derived from the wind or the sun. Yet, he flew constantly across continents and mastered rudimentary programming. He once told me computers were an abomination but many years later used them like a pro. Yes, there were contradictions and as you read these essays, take a step back. Probe for the deeper meaning. As California's governor, I am building America's first high-speed rail system and pushing a relentless expansion of renewable energy. Yet, I still reflect on Illich's ideas about acceleration and transportation and even energy. Illich makes you think. He forces you to question your own deepest assumptions. And as you do, you become a better thinker. Illich said equity would not come with more economic growth. That's a hard doctrine. We all want our GDP to grow. Yet look at the growth in inequality these last 20 years. Could he have seen that coming? Illich warned of counterproductivity, the negative consequences of exceeding certain thresholds. Are there tipping points in standardized schooling, medical interventions, transportation, energy consumption and the devices it makes possible? Illich wrote of learning as opposed to being taught in classrooms. Now the internet is opening access to knowledge and making learning possible outside of institutional constraints. Illich early on warned of the ecological dangers of poisons and pollution generated by modern technologies, but he thought the breakdown in our social and cultural traditions was more pressing and more dangerous. The way he lived, the simplicity and the caring of one human being for another, illuminates the underlying message of all his writings. He saw in modern life and its pervasive dependence on commodities and the services of professionals a threat to what it is to be human. He cut through the illusions and allurements to better ground us in what it means to be alive. He was joyful but he didn't turn his gaze from human suffering. He lived and wrote in the fullness of life and confronted, with humor and uncommon clarity, the paradoxes and contradictions, the possibilities and yes, the limitations of being mortal. These essays will provoke you but they will also shine some light on the wonders of our time, its dangers and accompanying illusions. Jerry Brown. Governor of California. May 2013. After Illich. An Introduction. By Sajay Samuel. The ecological and economic crises have passed. The word crisis derives from the Greek crisis, which referred to that moment in the course of an illness when it decisively turns towards either health, as when a fever breaks into a sweat, or death, as when the pulse fatally weakens. Crisis marks the moment beyond the fork in the road, when the road not taken fades into the distance. The economic crisis is behind us because full employment is no longer thought to be achievable, whether in advanced or emerging economies. Billions worldwide are unemployed. Millions more are underemployed or belong to the class of the working poor whose wages do little to lift them from misery. The ecological crisis is in the past as well in that the physical environment surrounding humans has turned inhospitable to many. Disappeared forests, privatized lands, paved streets, and foul airs are but some of the features of degraded land on which few can subsist. Even as they dimly recognize it, many react to this state of affairs with a mix of resistance, anger, and fear. From Puerta del Sol in Madrid to Zuccotti Park in New York City, young and old have agitated for work. Hundreds of thousands eagerly seek low-wages jobs available only to a tiny fraction. Desperate to obtain employment, many students borrow money to pay for the privilege of working as interns, On Earth Day 2012, although millions of people assembled from Melbourne to Maui to protest intensifying environmental degradation, research funds now pile up for geoengineering on a planetary scale. Proposed schemes include stirring the oceans to absorb more carbon, as if seawater were simply tea in a giant cup. In towns and counties across central Pennsylvania, citizens accept poisoned aquifers and waterways as necessary consequences of clean natural gas. 40 years ago, Ivan Illich, 1926–2002, foresaw the coming crises. He argued that the industrialized societies of the mid-20th century, including communist Russia and capitalist USA, were already burdened by too much employment and too much energy. Explaining that habituation to employment frustrates and destroys self-reliance, and that the increasing power of machines deepens dependence on them, Illich warned against those whose misunderstanding of crisis would perversely bring on what they sought to avoid. Even though this is precisely what they have wrought, politicians and scientists continue to stubbornly insist that the economic crisis is simply a matter of not enough jobs and that the ecological crisis is a matter of not enough clean energy. Not enough jobs channels attention to creating more employment by expanding the economy, just as not enough clean energy confines debate to getting more of it through techniques that reduce carbon emissions. This persistent fixation on more employment and more energy has now found expression in dreams of a so-called green economy, which in one stroke will somehow wipe out unemployment and renew the environment. It's a fixation that blinds us, Illich noted decades ago, to recognizing the thresholds beyond which useless humans will be forced to occupy uninhabitable environments. Doubtless, the fear and anxiety of a jobless life is palpable to the intern who must pay to work in a job. So are the incomprehension and anger of the family who is homeless when displaced by a hurricane. But millions of others, who may be luckier, feel trapped between the pincers of shrinking paychecks and the rising costs of gas, heating oil, and food. For the many who must bear it, however, this feeling of vulnerability and precariousness need not lead to paralyzing despair. Instead, forced by their circumstances to acknowledge that widespread unemployment and a ravaged environment are here to stay, they may, with wisdom and humor, rediscover ways of living well. Precisely because good jobs and clean energy are now thought scarce, it is more than ever possible to begin the task of rethinking our attachments to employment and energy. Selected from Illich's many essays, pamphlets and drafts, the 4 items reprinted here remain vitally important to that task. Though written between 1973 and 1983, they retain an urgent relevance to those who must inhabit a world without secure employment or supportive environments. Employment is good, economic growth is necessary, technical innovations liberate. These were unquestioned assumptions when Illich was writing these essays. They continue to maintain their grip on the collective imagination, although less tightly. Critical reconsideration becomes all the more difficult when an assumption has been left unquestioned long enough to be taken for a certainty and to even congeal into perception. Unlike many of his time and later, Illich's thought is radical in the sense of going to the roots of modern perceptions. These unsettling and disturbing pages are therefore likely to be useful now to those who seek to find a way, for whatever reason, beyond economics and ecology. But the reader must exercise forbearance. First, these essays carry the mark of the confrontations Illich engaged in at the time. During the late 1960s through the early 1980s, Illich spoke to packed houses from San Francisco to Sri Lanka, was feted by politicians such as Indira Gandhi and Pierre Trudeau, engaged intellectually with the likes of Michel Foucault and Erich Fromm, and became a fierce and outspoken, if still obedient critic of the Roman Catholic Church which had once viewed him as a favorite son. Second, his thinking cannot be filtered through the political categories of left/right or progressive/conservative. They are unhelpful to fully appreciate a thinker who critiques both the market economy and the welfare state, who takes issue with the economic presuppositions held by both capitalist and socialist regimes, and who questions the supposed virtues of both family values and working women. Third, and perhaps most important, his texts seem easy to read because he wore his considerable learning lightly. Their smooth surfaces belie finely wrought conceptual distinctions that support densely packed arguments. If they are to fully enjoy these sometimes polemical, sometimes humorous, but always sparingly crafted pieces of prose, readers who think they have read a text on skimming it will have to slow down and savor Illich's words. Each of the 4 essays reprinted here was written for a specific occasion and together comprise only the smallest selection from a larger corpus questioning commodity and energy-intensive economies. The essays are presented thematically instead of chronologically to offer a better view of the sweep of Illich's argument. In the first 2, War Against Subsistence and Shadow Work, Illich reveals both the ruins on which the economy is built and the blindness of economics which cannot but fail to see it. The second 2 essays, Energy and Equity and the Social Construction of Energy, unearthed the 19th century invention and subsequent consequences of energy thought of as the unseen cause of all work whether done by steam engines, humans, or trees. The science of ecology relies on this assumption and, as Illich explained, unwittingly fuels the addiction to energy. The close dance of energy consumption and economic growth is characteristic of not just industrially geared societies. After all, energy consumption steadily increases even in so-called post-industrial societies, fueling the fortunes of Google and Apple no less than Walmart. Historians have marked the transition from agrarian to industrial society by that phenomenon called the enclosure of the commons, seen vividly in Great Britain but elsewhere as well. The commons referred to the fields, fens, wastelands and woods to which access was free to all for pasturing livestock, planting crops, foraging for fuel wood, and gleaning leftover grain. Well into the 18th century, commoners comprised a substantial proportion of the British population and derived the greater portion of their sustenance from the commons instead of the market. From the mid-17th century, but particularly over the 100 years until 1850, thousands of enclosure acts legalized enclosures that forced commoners to become landless peasants with no independent means of subsistence. Now fully dependent on paid work, they became the working class. Privatizing the commons meant transforming land that was open to general use into an economic resource. Since scarce resources require legal and police protections, Illich insisted on not confusing the commons with public property. The latter, no less than private property, is protected by the police, as for example are public parks and free speech zones. In contrast, mutual aid, custom and customary rights among kin and interdependent households characterized use of the commons. The life in common was not devoid of market relations, as for example when working occasionally or purchasing salt. But as Illich noted in his essay Useful Unemployment and Its Professional Enemies, all through history, the best measure for bad times was the percentage of food eaten that had to be purchased. Commoning gave those who relied on it a floor against destitution. It is the vital importance given to provisioning over profiteering that accounts for such common customs as limits to the hoarding of grains during times of dearth. As the historians E. P. Thompson and J. M. Neeson have explained at length, a moral economy encases and fetters the market economy when dependence on the market is balanced by the independence of self-subsistence. However, Illich argued, the enclosure of the commons was but one chapter in a longer history of the war against subsistence. Indeed, it may not even be industrial products that best exemplify the separation of people from their ability to subsist. Instead, he suggested, the service economy offers a more prototypical example for the separation of what economists call production from consumption. As Illich argued in Vernacular Values, in the same year that Columbus accidentally discovered the New World, Elio Antonio de Nebrija petitioned Queen Isabella of Spain to adopt a tool to colonize the language spoken by her own subjects. From Catalonia to Andalusia, the Iberian Peninsula of the 15th century was home to a profusion of vernaculars forged in the kiln of everyday trade, prayer and love. Columbus, who spoke several languages and wrote in a couple more that he could not speak, is a perfect example of how adept people can be without taught language skills. But Nebrija intended his Castilian grammar book and accompanying dictionary as tools to separate people from their untutored ability to speak. He intended for taught, standardized language to discipline people's tongues in the interest of imperial power. What was for Nebrija a stratagem of empire has by now become a need. In contemporary India, everyday speech is taught speech, whether it is the Hindi spoken at the store, the Tamil chattered at home, or the Boston English used to answer 1-800 helplines on behalf of Citibank. Speech is no longer uttered in the course of daily life but results from the consumption of a scarce commodity acquired from language instructors. For Illich, it is the modern professions that function as the most potent propagandists of human needs, whether for schools or for hospitals. Indeed, in his essay on the disabling professions, he argued that the construction of humans as needy beings was one of the most pernicious consequences of economic society. In the guise of experts, professionals discriminate against people by imputing a lack, an inability, or a need. They then mask such discrimination by justifying it as doing a service, prompted by their care. This expertly managed belief that humans are beings in need of services from certified professionals has deep roots beginning in the 8th century. As Illich elaborated and taught mother tongue, it was then that priests became pastors by defining their own services as needs of human nature and by linking salvation to the obligatory consumption of those services. Illich proposed to resuscitate the word vernacular in its historical reference to what is homemade, homegrown and homebred, as a more fitting term than subsistence, human economies, or informal sectors, to refer to what people do for themselves, whether that is singing, cultivating crops, building homes or playing. In the sense he gives the word, the vernacular denotes non-market activities, those not captured by the logic of exchange, without thereby implying a privatized activity, a hobby or an irrational and primitive procedure. The separation of people from vernacular practices delivers them to a regime of scarcity. A dependence on scarce goods and services can be maintained by force, as with zoning laws prohibiting backyard or rooftop chicken coops. Compulsory schooling, like most other expert and professionally defined services, commands dependence by imputing legally sanctioned needs. But institutionalizing envy can also propel dependence on commodities. As Illich argued in Gender, traditional cultures recognized invidious comparison as destructive of social relations and devised symbolic forms such as the evil eye to suppress it. But modern economies are organized to mask envy as a way to better disseminate it. Keeping up with the Joneses or bettering one's condition are slogans that rhetorically blunt what the pastor Bernard Mandeville in 1714 baldly stated as the formula for economic growth: private vices, public benefits. Despite the contrary assertion of standard economics textbooks, Illich thus argues that modern economies do not solve the problem of scarcity. Instead, the economy is better understood as a machine for the production of scarcity, whether through force, need, or envy. The destruction of the vernacular is both cause and consequence of the economy, and the resulting subject of the economy is possessive, invidious and needy. Economic ideologists of all stripes, including socialists and capitalists, are convinced of a human need for education and electricity. Their shared conviction reveals them as agents united in the ongoing war against the vernacular, advertised as the virtuous and uplifting cycle of work and consumption. Throughout the Middle Ages, wage labor was considered a mark of the miserable and thought to be a fate worse than beggary. By the 16th century, labor was ennobled and dignified as work by the likes of Martin Luther and John Calvin. By the 17th century, those who stood to profit from it argued that work was a natural cure for poverty, which was seen as being caused by laziness or indolence. Conveniently, the assumption turned perception of work as natural overlooks that it is the very dependence on wages that modernizes poverty. As Illich pointed out, the modernized poor are those who are prevented from living outside the economy and yet are forced to occupy its bottom rungs. But, argued Illich, the thoroughgoing dependence on cash is only the visible tip of an even deeper injustice. A society organized around putting people to work will necessarily create shadow work, which Illich defined as the unpaid toil needed to make commodities and services fully useful. If one has to buy eggs because one cannot keep chickens, then the effort of going to the market, finding a parking spot, and returning home comprises frustrating shadow work. One is engaged in shadow work when doing one's homework because one is compelled to attend school, or when surfing the internet to get information on one's medical options. The hours lost in commuting to make oneself useful to an employer is shadow work necessary to make a living. Illich found the paradigm of shadow work in housework. Unlike commoners, workers in the modern economy typically do not consume directly the fruits of their labor. Until the early 19th century, this forced separation of production from consumption fueled protracted protests, many led by women. Illich argued that these protests were quelled, in part, by glorifying the confinement of women to their houses. The fairer sex rhetorically ennobled the enclosure of women as housewives whose unpaid toil exemplifies the historically new sphere of shadow work. The house as the site of unpaid reproduction is the necessary shadow cast by the workplace as the space of paid production. The creation of unpaid work as a requirement that other work be paid, suggested to Illich that the subject of economics was also genderless. The economy is fundamentally sexist, he argued, because it recognizes the human only in its capacity to produce and reproduce. Even if women are drawn into the workforce and men are encouraged to help with child rearing, most of the unpaid toil is overwhelmingly borne by women. More generally, he speculated that the economy would collapse if all the shadow work required for its functioning were to be paid for. How much would Facebook be worth if its users were paid for their efforts to produce content and consume advertisements? Shadow work remains hidden partly because it is sentimentalized. The defense of family values sentimentalizes sexist oppression by maintaining the fantasy that the modern house continues immemorial tradition, whereas the demand that housework be paid only exposes the paradoxical freedom sought in dependence on wage work. Shadow work does not foster vernacular modes of living, nor does it nourish the realm of autonomous being together. Instead, it supports and deepens the dependence on a life given to employment, even when there are fewer jobs available. Parents devote countless hours to their children's homework to upgrade the human capital that schooling delivers to the workplace. Illich noted that sentimentalizing such shadow work as quality time is the kind of dishonesty needed to live with the iniquities inherent in commodity-intensive markets. 40 years ago, Illich suggested self-service would be the species of shadow work that would likely expand faster than wage labor. That may have come to pass, when computer-prompted busy work such as online banking and deleting spam is added to the time spent on home improvement projects, lifelong learning and unpaid internships. He also argued, in Energy and Equity, that the continued growth of energy-intensive social arrangements would destroy more than just the physical habitat of men and women. In hindsight, his tightly argued warning and plea point to the road not taken as the crises gathered. It may however still offer hope to those now caught in the vice of endemic underemployment and a ravaged environment. The widespread belief that economic growth comes at the cost of ecological despoliation overlooks the more decisive and prior destruction of the socio-cultural milieu of a people, the vernacular. For this reason Illich wrote in Silence is a Commons that the most virulent kind of ecological degradation occurs with the transformation of the environment from a commons to a productive resource. It is not just that land then becomes real estate, viewed from a distance rather than trodden underfoot. Rather, economic values proliferate by engulfing the variegated ways of living in common, a kind of destruction reflected sharply in the steady vanishing of languages. While waste and pollution caused by economic growth describe environmental degradation, Illich recommended the term disvalue to name the denigration and destruction of the social environments necessary to propel that growth. Not so long ago, services and commodities swirled only around the margins of everyday life. Today they are everywhere. For most of human history, tools were shaped to the natural abilities of their users. Today people function as appendages of their tools, which set the rhythm and pace of their lives. Whether they are cars or high-tech hospitals, when the quantity of commodities and services exceed a certain threshold of intensity, they exclude non-market alternatives and therefore impose what Illich called a radical monopoly. Paved streets for cars and rails for trains demand the earth be reshaped to fit. But to this environment degradation must be added three kinds of frustration that results from the radical monopoly of energy-intensive commodities. Too many cars on the road spark road rage, and too much education produces incurious teens. Both are examples of a frustrating subversion that Illich named technical counterproductivity. Speedy cars push bicycles and pedestrians off the streets just as too many emails and television shows overwhelm face-to-face conversations. This displacement of vernacular activity by economic artifacts he called structural counterproductivity. Just as consumers of too many passenger miles believe they can move only when they are sitting on a moving seat, so the buyers of too many student credits believe they can learn only what they are taught. The self-perception of both expresses the cultural counterproductivity that result from the repeated use of packaged goods, just as myths are engendered by ritualized behaviors. That the ecological and economic problems are still understood in terms of scarcity, whether of clean energy or well-paid jobs, reveals how deeply self-perception has been shaped by the overuse and suffocating presence of commodity-intensive markets and energy-intensive technologies. Economics and ecology cannot comprehend the vernacular, Illich argues, in the social construction of energy, because they mystify a social construction as a natural phenomenon. From its very beginnings, the science of ecology imbibed the assumption of scarcity and imputed it to the whole of nature. Bees and trees, whales and bacteria, all species are seen as locked in a battle over scarce nutrients. In documenting the twists and turns that scientists took during the 19th century to construct energy as the invisible and indestructible source of all work, Illich shows how both work and energy, when used in everyday language, makes a scientific construction appear to be a natural phenomena. Whether aggregated as population or proletariat, individuals are understood en masse as a source of labor power to be worked. In the same time frame, the universe or nature itself came to be understood economically as an energy generator with the potential for work. Illich suggests the entwined assumptions that nature works and that work is a natural masquerade for certainties that now prop up a world built for energy-intensive employment. To Illich, the differences between economics and ecology were less significant than the presumptions they shared. The economist wants to replace people with cheaper, more efficient machines. The ecologist wants to get rid of cars and replace them with energy-saving bicycles. However, neither suspects that machines and people are incomparable, except as objects of science. For the scientist, work is done and energy is consumed by a steam engine, a rat, a data center and a pedestrian. And as ecologists and economists now form an alliance to tout the so-called green economy, they subject the economy of commodities to the greater economy of energy. They tighten the noose of scarce resources without contributing to freedom from dependence on jobs and jewels. As Illich noted many years ago, radical monopoly would accompany high-speed traffic even if motors were powered by sunshine and vehicles spun of air. The radical monopolization of vernacular life has now made it almost impossible to live without high-energy inputs, outside the cycle of work and consumption, beyond the grip of scarcity. Yet by the force of circumstance, this is the situation that many must now contend with as wage work dries up and shadow work grows. To protect the means of provisioning for themselves, commoners once agitated not for minimum wages but for a ceiling on the profits derived from enclosing the commons. They did not want a handout but instead insisted on the liberty to fend for themselves. Similarly, Illich argues that the speed of motor-powered vehicles on common streets be limited so as not to hinder the natural mobility of people on foot or bicycle. Such proposals are unlikely to make much of an impression on energy addicts and workaholics. But they may intrigue others wanting to kick bad habits. However, if, above all, the task of living differently entails the task of thinking differently, then one must first escape the illusions fostered by such pop scientific terms as work and energy. To help with this, Illich favored thinking with concepts rooted in bodily experience. In contrast, transportation scientists have no concepts to distinguish biking under one's own power from being freighted in a bus. For them, both are comparable methods of locomotion. Social scientists define poverty by the quantity of income. So understood, poverty does not contrast the misery of those who are dependent on cash with the self-sufficiency of those who do not need it. Illich insisted on conceptual clarity rooted in felt perception as an antidote to the indiscriminating constructs of scientific thought. These remarks do not summarize the 4 essays by Illich. Instead, they are invitations to rediscover a thinker who saw deeply into fundamental questions. Illich's texts demand and reward close attention. 1 In that effort, 3 misunderstandings should be avoided. First, only the inattentive reader will conclude that Illich was against technology per se. Such a reader must have misunderstood an argument built on defending, for example, bicycles, libraries, aspirin and books, all of which may use high-tech materials and industrial methods of production. A second and related confusion is to believe that Illich argued for the complete abolition of scarce commodities and services, whether computers or medicine. He simply insisted on discerning the quanta of commodities needed to expand the range of autarkic action, the proportion of power tools that would not destroy the use of one's hands. Third, one should guard against the idea that because he diagnosed the present from the vantage point of history, Illich was also calling for a return to the past. Instead, as he stated in the 3 dimensions of public choice, such a choice does not exist, and such aspirations would be sentimental and destructive. If he cautioned there is no way back, Illich also refused the seductions of futurists. These visionaries of freedom now promise redemption through a low-carbon full-employment future. 40 years ago, Illich saw into that future and recognized there the tightening shackles of wages geared to Watts. Readers who share that recognition may be now prompted to laugh at the ardor of their attachment to false promises. That laughter may also liberate, in those who desire it, new efforts to invent and imagine ways of living that are truly free. To them, debates still tethered by expanding markets and powerful machines are irrelevant. They realize that the noisy discussions between proponents of regulated instead of free markets leave unquestioned the rule of scarce resources. They also see the confining grip of technoscience in claims that sustainable technologies will cure technologically caused damages. Moreover, those searching and inventing styles of living relatively free from the rule of economic value and technoscience are not doctrinaire. They know that the vernacular stubbornly persists in the interstices of contemporary life and lies orthogonally to commodity-intensive markets and energy-intensive machines. They stitch together, as in a patchwork quilt, modes of life oriented by the homemade, homegrown, and homebred. They adroitly sidestep the charge of hypocrisy when leveled by those who disparage and repress vernacular ways. They leave purity of intent to the priests, definitional exactness to the academics, and despair to the intellectuals. Now freed of illusory attachments, they are too engaged in figuring out the shape of a sweeter, more beautiful life amidst the ruins bequeathed to them. Valentina Boremans graciously gave me the permission to republish these essays. Catherine Kilgariff of Marion Boyars not only keeps many of Illich's books in print but also has been generous in her accommodation of missed deadlines. I am pleased to acknowledge John Verity's editorial suggestions that spurred me to rewrite this text. Carl Mitchum's suggestions helped polish it to the finish it now possesses. I remain grateful for the nourishing patience of Samar Faraj. None of them is responsible for the remaining errors and infelicities. Sajay Samuel. May 2013. 1 Ivan Illich in Conversation, Toronto, Anansi Press, 2002, remains the single best source to enter the thought of Illich at a leisurely pace. David Cayley, a master at his craft, conducts the conversation. The War Against Subsistence. By Ivan Illich. Historians have chosen Columbus' voyage from Pallas as a date convenient for marking the transition from the Middle Ages to modern times, a point useful for changing editors of textbooks. But the world of Ptolemy did not become the world of Mercator in 1 year, nor did the world of the vernacular become the age of education overnight. Rather, traditional cosmography was gradually adjusted in the light of widening experience. Columbus was followed by Cortés, Copernicus by Kepler, Nebrija by Comenius. Unlike personal insight, the change in worldview that generated our dependence on goods and services took 500 years. How often the hand of the clock advances depends on the language of the ciphers on the quadrant. The Chinese speak of 5 stages in sprouting, and dawn approaches in 7 steps for the Arabs. If I were to describe the evolution of Homo economicus from Mandeville to Marx or Galbraith, I would come to a different view of epochs than if I had a mind to outline the stages in which the ideology of Homo educandus developed from Nebrija through Radke to Comenius. And again, within this same paradigm, a different set of turning points would best describe the decay of untutored learning and the route toward the inescapable miseducation that educational institutions necessarily dispense. It took a good decade to recognize that Columbus had found a new hemisphere, not just a new route. It took much longer to invent the concept New World for the continent whose existence he had denied. A full century and a half separated the claim of Nebrija, in the Queen's service he had to teach all her subjects to speak, and the claim of John Amos Comenius, the possession of a method by which an army of schoolteachers would teach everybody everything perfectly. By the time of Comenius, 1592 to 1670, the ruling groups of both the Old and New Worlds were deeply convinced of the need for such a method. An incident in the history of Harvard College aptly illustrates the point. On the 150th birthday of Nebrija's grammar, John Winthrop Jr. was on his way to Europe searching for a theologian and educator to accept the presidency of Harvard. One of the first persons he approached was the Czech Comenius, leader and last bishop of the Moravian Church. Winthrop found him in London, where he was organizing the Royal Society and advising the government on public schools. In Magna Didactica, vel ars omnibus omni omnino docendi, Comenius had succinctly defined the goals of his profession. Education begins in the womb and does not end until death. Whatever is worth knowing is worth teaching by a special method appropriate to the subject. The preferred world is the one so organized that it functions as a school for all. Only if learning is the result of teaching can individuals be raised to the fullness of their humanity. People who learn without being taught are more like animals than men. And the school system must be so organized that all, old and young, rich and poor, noble and low, men and women, be taught effectively, not just symbolically and ostentatiously. These are the thoughts written by the potential president of Harvard. But he never crossed the Atlantic. By the time Winthrop met him, he had already accepted the invitation of the Swedish government to organize a national system of schools for Queen Christina. Unlike Nebrija, he never had to argue the need for his services, they were always in great demand. The domain of the vernacular, considered untouchable by Isabella, had become the hunting ground for job-seeking Spanish letrados, Jesuits, and Czech divines. A sphere of formal education had been disembedded. Formally taught mother tongue professionally handled according to abstract rules had begun to compare with and encroach upon the vernacular. This gradual replacement and degradation of the vernacular by its costly counterfeit heralds the coming of the market-intensive society in which we now live. Vernacular comes from an Indo-Germanic root that implies rootedness and abode. Vernaculum as a Latin word was used for whatever was homebred, homespun, homegrown, homemade, as opposed to what was obtained in formal exchange. The child of one's slave and of one's wife, the donkey born of one's own beast, were vernacular beings, as was the staple that came from the garden or the commons. If Carl Polanyi had adverted to this fact, he might have used the term in the meaning accepted by the ancient Romans, sustenance derived from reciprocity patterns embedded in every aspect of life, as distinguished from sustenance that comes from exchange or from vertical distribution. Vernacular was used in this general sense from pre-classical times down to the technical formulations found in the Codex of Theodosius. It was Varro who picked the term to introduce the same distinction in language. For him, vernacular speech is made up of the words and patterns grown on the speaker's own ground, as opposed to what is grown elsewhere and then transported. And since Varro's authority was widely recognized, his definition stuck. He was the librarian of both Caesar and Augustus and the first Roman to attempt a thorough and critical study of the Latin language. His Lingua Latina was a basic reference book for centuries. Quintilian admired him as the most learned of all Romans. And Quintilian, the Spanish-born drill master for the future senators of Rome, is always proposed to normal students as one of the founders of their profession. But neither can be compared to Nebrija. Both Varro and Quintilian were concerned with shaping the speech of senators and scribes, the speech of the forum. Not so Nebrija, he sought control in the Queen's name over the everyday speech of all her people. Simply, Nabria proposed to substitute a mother tongue for the vernacular. Vernacular came into English in the one restricted sense to which Varro had confined its meaning. Just now, I would like to resuscitate some of its old breath. We need a simple, straightforward word to designate the activities of people when they are not motivated by thoughts of exchange, a word that denotes autonomous, non-market-related actions through which people satisfy everyday needs, the actions that by their own true nature escape bureaucratic control, satisfying needs to which, in the very process, they give specific shape. Vernacular seems a good old word for this purpose, and should be acceptable to many contemporaries. There are technical words that designate the satisfaction of needs that economists do not or cannot measure, social production as opposed to economic production, the generation of use values as opposed to the production of commodities, household economics as opposed to market economics. But these terms are specialized, tainted with some ideological prejudice, and each, in a different way, badly limps. Each contrasting pair of terms, in its own way, also fosters the confusion that assigns vernacular undertakings to unpaid, standardized, formalized activities. It is this kind of confusion I wish to clarify. We need a simple adjective to name those acts of competence, lust, or concern that we want to defend from measurement or manipulation by Chicago boys and socialist commissars. The term must be broad enough to fit the preparation of food and the shaping of language, childbirth and recreation, without implying either a privatized activity akin to the housework of modern women, a hobby or an irrational and primitive procedure. Such an adjective is not at hand. But vernacular might serve. By speaking about vernacular language and the possibility of its recuperation, I am trying to bring into awareness and discussion the existence of a vernacular mode of being, doing, and making that in a desirable future society might again expand in all aspects of life. Mother tongue, since the term was first used, has never meant the vernacular, but rather its contrary. The term was first used by Catholic monks to designate a particular language they used, instead of Latin, when speaking from the pulpit. No Indo-Germanic culture before had used the term. The word was introduced into Sanskrit in the 18th century as a translation from the English. The term has no roots in the other major language families now spoken on which I could check. The only classical people who viewed their homeland as a kind of mother were the Cretans. Bachofen suggests that memories of an old matriarchal order still lingered in their culture. But even in Crete, there was no equivalent to mother tongue. To trace the association which led to the term mother tongue, I shall first have to look at what happened at the court of Charlemagne, and then what happened later in the Abbey of Gurs. The idea that humans are born in such fashion that they need institutional service from professional agents in order to reach that humanity for which by birth all people are destined can be traced down to Carolingian times. It was then that, for the first time in history, it was discovered that there are certain basic needs that are universal to mankind and that cry out for satisfaction in a standard fashion that cannot be met in a vernacular way. The discovery is perhaps best associated with the church reform that took place in the 8th century. The Scottish monk Alcuin, the former chancellor of York University who became the court philosopher of Charles the Great, played a prominent role in this reform. Up to that time the church had considered its ministers primarily as priests, that is, as men selected and invested with special powers to meet communitary, liturgical, public needs. They were engaged in preaching at ritual occasions and had to preside at functions. They acted as public officials, analogous to those others through whom the state provided for the administration of justice, or, in Roman times, for public work. To think of these kinds of magistrates as if they were service professionals would be an anachronistic projection of our contemporary categories. But then, from the 8th century on, the classical priest rooted in Roman and Hellenistic models began to be transmogrified into the precursor of the service professional, the teacher, social worker, or educator. Church ministers began to cater to the personal needs of parishioners and to equip themselves with a sacramental and pastoral theology that defined and established these needs for their regular service. The institutionally defined care of the individual, the family, the village community, acquires unprecedented prominence. The term Holy Mother the Church ceases almost totally to mean the actual assembly of the faithful whose love, under the impulse of the Holy Spirit, engenders new life in the very act of meeting. The term Mother henceforth refers to an invisible, mystical reality from which alone those services absolutely necessary for salvation can be obtained. Henceforth, access to the good graces of this Mother on whom universally necessary salvation depends is entirely controlled by a hierarchy of ordained males. This gender-specific mythology of male hierarchies mediating access to the institutional source of life is without precedent. From the 9th to the 11th century, the idea took shape that there are some needs common to all human beings that can be satisfied only through service from professional agents. Thus the definition of needs in terms of professionally defined commodities in the service sector proceeds by millennium the industrial production of universally needed basic goods. 35 years ago, Lewis Mumford tried to make this point. When I first read his statement that the monastic reform of the 9th century created some of the basic assumptions on which the industrial system is founded, I could not be convinced by something I considered more of an intuition than a proof. In the meantime, though, I have found a host of converging arguments, most of which Mumford does not seem to suspect, for rooting the ideologies of the industrial age and the earlier Carolingian Renaissance. The idea that there is no salvation without personal services provided by professionals in the name of an institutional mother church is one of these formerly unnoticed developments without which, again, our own age would be unthinkable. True, it took 500 years of medieval theology to elaborate on this concept. Only by the end of the Middle Ages would the pastoral self-image of the Church be fully rounded. And only in the Council of Trent, 1545, would this self-image of the Church as a mother milked by clerical hierarchies become formally defined. Then, in the Constitution of the Second Vatican Council, 1964, the Catholic Church, which had served in the past as the prime model for the evolution of secular service organizations, aligns itself explicitly in the image of its secular imitations. The important point here is the notion that the clergy can define its services as needs of human nature, and make this service commodity the kind of necessity that cannot be foregone without jeopardy to eternal life. It is in this ability of a non-hereditary elite that we ought to locate the foundation without which the contemporary service or welfare state would not be conceivable. Surprisingly little research has been done on the religious concepts that fundamentally distinguish the industrial age from all other epochs. The official decline of the vernacular conception of Christian life in favor of one organized around pastoral care is a complex and drawn-out process constituting the background for a set of consistent shifts in the language and institutional development of the West. When Europe first began to take shape as an idea and as a political reality, between Merovingian times and the High Middle Ages, what people spoke was unproblematic. It was called Romance or Theodisc-Peopleish. Only somewhat later, lingua vulgaris became the common denominator distinguishing popular speech from the Latin of administration and doctrine. Since Roman times, a person's first language was the patria sermo, the language of the male head of the household. Each such sermo or speech was perceived as a separate language. Neither in ancient Greece nor in the Middle Ages did people make the modern distinction between mutually understandable dialects and different languages. The same holds true today, for example, at the grassroots in India. What we know today as monolingual communities were and, in fact, are exceptions. From the Balkans to Indochina's western frontiers, it is still rare to find a village in which one cannot get along in more than 2 or 3 tongues. While it is assumed that each person has his patria sermo, it is equally taken for granted that most persons speak several vulgar tongues, each in a vernacular, untaught way. Thus the vernacular, in opposition to specialized, learned language, Latin for the church, Frankish for the court, was as obvious in its variety as the taste of local wines and food, as the shapes of house and hoe, down to the 11th century. It is at this moment, quite suddenly, that the term mother tongue appears. It shows up in the sermons of some monks from the Abbey of Gurs. The process by which this phenomenon turns vernacular speech into a moral issue can only be touched upon here. Gurs was a mother abbey in Lorraine, not far from Verdun. Benedictine monks had founded the monastery in the 8th century, around bones believed to belong to Saint Gorgonius. During the 9th century, a time of widespread decay in ecclesiastical discipline, Gurs, too, suffered a notorious decline. But only 3 generations after such scandalous dissolution Gurs became the center of monastic reform in the Germanic areas of the empire. Its reinvigoration of Cistercian life paralleled the work of the Reform Abbey of Cluny. Within a century, 160 daughter abbeys throughout the northeastern parts of Central Europe were established from Gurs. It seems quite probable that Gurs was then at the center of the diffusion of a new technology that was crucial for the later imperial expansion of the European powers, the transformation of the horse into the tractor of choice. 4 Asiatic inventions, the horseshoe, the fixed saddle and stirrup, the bit, and the cummet, the collar resting on the shoulder, permitted important and extensive changes. 1 horse could replace 6 oxen. While supplying the same traction, and more speed, a horse could be fed on the acreage needed for 1 yoke of oxen. Because of its speed, the horse permitted a more extensive cultivation of the wet, northern soils, in spite of the short summers. Also, greater rotation of crops was possible. But even more importantly, the peasant could now tend fields twice as far away from his dwelling. A new pattern of life became possible. Formerly, People had lived in clusters of homesteads, now they could form villages large enough to support a parish and, later, a school. Through dozens of abbeys, monastic learning and discipline, together with the reorganization of settlement patterns, spread throughout this part of Europe. Gorse lies close to the line that divides Frankish from Romance types of vernacular, and some monks from Cluny began to cross this line. In these circumstances, the monks of Gorse made language, vernacular language, into an issue to defend their territorial claims. The monks began to preach in Frankish, and spoke specifically about the value of the Frankish tongue. They began to use the pulpit as a forum to stress the importance of language itself, perhaps even to teach it. From the little we know, they used at least two approaches. First, Frankish was the language spoken by the women, even in those areas where the men were already beginning to use a Romance vernacular. Second, it was the language now used by Mother Church. How charged with sacred meanings motherhood was in the religiosity of the 12th century one can grasp through contemplating the contemporary statues of the Virgin Mary, or from reading the liturgical sequences, the poetry of the time. The term mother tongue, from its very first use, instrumentalizes everyday language in the service of an institutional cause. The word was translated from Frankish into Latin. Then, as a rare Latin term, it incubated for several centuries. In the decades before Luther, quite suddenly and dramatically, mother tongue acquired a strong meaning. It came to mean the language created by Luther in order to translate the Hebrew Bible, the language taught by schoolmasters to read that book, and then the language that justified the existence of nation-states. Today, mother tongue means several things: the first language learned by the child, and the language which the authorities of the state have decided ought to be one's first language. Thus, mother tongue can mean the first language picked up at random, generally a very different speech from the one taught by paid educators and by parents who act as if they were such educators. We see, then, that people are considered as creatures who need to be taught to speak properly in order to communicate in the modern world, as they need to be wheeled about in motorized carriages in order to move in modern landscapes. Their feet no longer fit. Dependence on taught mother tongue can be taken as the paradigm of all other dependencies typical of humans in an age of commodity-defined needs. And the ideology of this dependence was formulated by Nabria. The ideology which claims that human mobility depends not on feet and open frontiers, but on the availability of transportation is only slightly more than 100 years old. Language teaching created employment long ago. Macadam and the suspended coach made the conveyance of people a big business only from about the middle of the 18th century. As language teaching has become a job, it has begun to cost a lot of money. Words are now one of the two largest categories of marketed values that make up the gross national product, GNP. Money decides what shall be said, who shall say it, when and what kind of people shall be targeted for the messages. The higher the cost of each uttered word, the more determined the echo demanded. In schools people learn to speak as they should. Money is spent to make the poor speak more like the wealthy, the sick more like the healthy, and the minority more like the majority. We pay to improve, correct, enrich, update the language of children and of their teachers. We spend more on the professional jargons that are taught in college, and more yet in high schools, to give teenagers a smattering of these jargons, but just enough to make them feel dependent on the psychologist, druggist, or librarian who is fluent in some special kind of English. We go even further. We first allow standard language to degrade ethnic, black, or hillbilly language, and then spend money to teach their counterfeits as academic subjects. Administrators and entertainers, admin and newsmen, ethnic politicians and radical professionals, form powerful interest groups, each fighting for a larger slice of the language pie. I do not really know how much is spent in the United States to make words. But soon someone will provide us with the necessary statistical tables. 10 years ago, energy accounting was almost unthinkable. Now it has become an established practice. Today you can easily look up how many energy units have gone into growing, harvesting, packaging, transporting, and merchandising one edible calorie of bread. The difference between the bread produced and eaten in a village in Greece and that found in an American supermarket is enormous. About 40 times more energy units are contained in each edible calorie of the latter. Bicycle traffic in cities permits one to move 4 times as fast as on foot for 1/4 of the energy expended, while cars, for the same progress, need 150 times as many calories per passenger mile. Information of this kind was available 10 years ago, but no one thought about it. Today, it is recorded and will soon lead to a change in people's outlook on the need for fuels. It would now be interesting to know what language accounting looks like, since the linguistic analysis of contemporary language is certainly not complete, unless for each group of speakers we know the amount of money spent on shaping the speech of the average person. Just as social energy accounts are only approximate and at best allow us to identify the orders of magnitude within which the relative values are found, so language accounting would provide us with data on the relative prevalence of standardized, taught language in a population, sufficient, however, for the argument I want to make. But mere per capita expenditure employed to mold the language of a group of speakers does not tell us enough. No doubt we would learn that each paid word addressed to the rich costs, per capita, much more than words addressed to the poor. Watts are actually more democratic than words. But taught language comes in a vast range of qualities. The poor, for instance, are much more blared than the rich, who can buy tutoring and, what is more precious, hedge on their own high-class vernacular by purchasing silence. The educator, politician and entertainer now come with a loudspeaker to Oaxaca, to Travancore, to the Chinese commune, and the poor immediately forfeit the claim to that indispensable luxury, the silence out of which vernacular language arises. Yet even without putting a price tag on silence, even without the more detailed language economics on which I would like to draw, I can still estimate that the dollars spent to power any nation's motors pale before those that are now expended on prostituting speech in the mouths of paid speakers. In rich nations, language has become incredibly spongy, absorbing huge investments. Generous expenditure to cultivate the language of the Mandarin, the author, the actor, or the charmer have always been a mark of high civilization. But these were efforts to teach elites special codes. Even the cost of making some people learn secret languages in traditional societies is incomparably lower than the capitalization of language in industrial societies. In poor countries today, people still speak to each other without the experience of capitalized language, although such countries always contain a tiny elite who manage very well to allocate a larger proportion of the national income for their prestige language. Let me ask, what is different in the everyday speech of groups whose language has received, or shall I say absorbed, resisted, survived, suffered, enjoyed, huge investments, and the speech of people whose language has remained outside the market? Comparing these two worlds of language, I want to focus my curiosity on just one issue that arises in this context. Does the structure and function of the language itself change with the rate of investment? Are these alterations such that all languages that absorb funds show changes in the same direction? In this introductory exploration of the subject, I cannot demonstrate that this is the case. But I do believe my arguments make both propositions highly probable, and show that structurally oriented language economics are worth exploring. Taught everyday language is without precedent in pre-industrial cultures. The current dependence on paid teachers and models of ordinary speech is just as much a unique characteristic of industrial economies as dependence on fossil fuels. The need for taught mother tongue was discovered 4 centuries earlier, but only in our generation have both language and energy been effectively treated as worldwide needs to be satisfied for all people by planned, programmed production and distribution. Because, unlike the vernacular of capitalized language, we can reasonably say that it results from production. Traditional cultures subsisted on sunshine, which was captured mostly through agriculture. The hoe, the ditch, the yoke, were basic means to harness the sun. Large sails or water wheels were known, but rare. These cultures that lived mostly on the sun subsisted basically on vernacular values. In such societies, tools were essentially the prolongation of arms, fingers, and legs. There was no need for the production of power in centralized plants and its distant distribution to clients. Equally, in these essentially sun-powered cultures, there was no need for language production. Language was drawn by each one from the cultural environment, learned from the encounter with people whom the learner could smell and touch, love or hate. The vernacular spread just as most things and services were shared, namely, by multiple forms of mutual reciprocity, rather than clientage to the appointed teacher or professional. Just as fuel was not delivered, so the vernacular was never taught. Taught tongues did exist, but they were rare as sails and sills. In most cultures, we know that speech resulted from conversation embedded in everyday life, from listening to fights and lullabies, gossip, stories, and dreams. Even today, the majority of people in poor countries learn all their language skills without any paid tutorship, without any attempt whatsoever to teach them how to speak. And they learn to speak in a way that nowhere compares with the self-conscious, self-important, colorless mumbling that, after a long stay in villages in South America and Southeast Asia, always shocks me when I visit an American college. I feel sorrow for those students whom education has made tone deaf. They have lost the faculty for hearing the difference between the desiccated utterance of standard television English and the living speech of the unschooled. What else can I expect, though, from people who are not brought up at a mother's breast, but on formula, on canned milk, if they are from poor families, and on a brew prepared under the nose of Ralph Nader if they are born among the enlightened? For people trained to choose between packaged formulas, mother's breast appears as just one more option. And in the same way, for people who are intentionally taught to listen and to speak, untutored vernacular seems just like another, albeit less developed, model among many. But this is simply false. Language exempt from rational tutorship is a different kind of social phenomenon from language that is purposefully taught. Where untutored language is the predominant marker of a shared world, a sense of power within the group exists, and this sense cannot be duplicated by language that is delivered. One way this difference shows is the sense of power over language itself, over its acquisition. Even today, the poor in non-industrial countries all over the world are polyglot. My friend, the goldsmith in Timbuktu, speaks Songhi at home, listens to Bambara on the radio, devotedly and with some understanding says his prayers 5 times a day in Arabic, gets along in 2 trade languages on the souk, converses in passable French that he picked up in the army, and none of these languages was formally taught him. He did not set out to learn these tongues, each is one style in which he remembers a peculiar set of experiences that fits into the frame of that language. Communities in which monolingual people prevail are rare except in 3 kinds of settings: tribal communities that have not really experienced the late Neolithic, communities that for a long time lived through exceptional forms of discrimination, and among the citizens of nation-states that, for several generations, have enjoyed the benefits of compulsory schooling. To take it for granted that most people are monolingual is typical of the members of the middle class. Admiration for the vernacular polyglot unfailingly exposes the social climber. Throughout history, untutored language was prevalent, but it was hardly ever the only kind of language known. Just as in traditional cultures some energy was captured through windmills and canals, and those who had large boats or those who cornered the right spot on the brook could use their tool for a net transfer of power to their own advantage, so some people have always used a taught language to corner some privilege. But such additional codes remained either rare and special, or served very narrow purposes. The ordinary language, until Nabriya, was prevalently vernacular. And this vernacular, be it the ordinary colloquial, a trade idiom, the language of prayer, the craft jargon, the language of basic accounts, the language of venery or of age, for example, baby talk, was learned on the side, as part of meaningful everyday life. Of course, Latin or Sanskrit were formally taught to the priest, court languages such as Frankish or Persian or Turkish were taught to the future scribe. Neophytes were formally initiated into the language of astronomy, alchemy, or late masonry. And, clearly, the knowledge of such formally taught languages raised a man above others, somewhat like the saddle lifts the free man above the serfs in the infantry, or the bridge lifts the captain above the crew. But even when access to some elite language was unlocked by a formal initiation, it did not necessarily mean that language was being taught. Quite frequently, the process of formal initiation did not transfer to the initiate a new language skill, but simply exempted him henceforth from a taboo that forbade others to use certain words, or to speak out on certain occasions. Male initiation in the language of the hunt or of sex is probably the most widespread example of such ritually selective language detabooization. But, in traditional societies, no matter how much or how little language was taught, the taught language rarely rubbed off on vernacular speech. Neither the existence of some language teaching at all times nor the spread of some language through professional preachers or comedians weakens my main point. Outside of those societies that we now call modern European, no attempt was made to impose on entire populations an everyday language that would be subject to the control of paid teachers or announcers. Everyday language, until recently, was nowhere the product of design, it was nowhere paid for and delivered like a commodity. And while every historian who deals with the origins of nation-states pays attention to the imposition of a national tongue, economists generally overlook the fact that this taught mother tongue is the earliest of specifically modern commodities, the model of all basic needs to come. Before I can go on to contrast taught colloquial speech and vernacular speech, costly language and that which comes at no cost, I must clarify one more distinction. Between taught mother tongue and the vernacular I draw the line of demarcation somewhere else than linguists when they distinguish the high language of an elite from the dialect spoken in lower classes, somewhere other than the frontier that separates regional and super-regional languages, somewhere else than restricted and corrected code, and somewhere else than at the line between the language of the literate and the illiterate. No matter how restricted within geographic boundaries, no matter how distinctive for a social level, no matter how specialized for one sex role or one caste, language can be either vernacular, in the sense in which I here use the term, or of the taught variety. Elite language, trade language, second language, local idiom, are nothing new. but each of these can be formally taught, and the taught counterfeit of the vernacular comes as a commodity and as something entirely new. The contrast between these two complementary forms is most marked and important in taught everyday language, that is, taught colloquial, taught standardized everyday speech. But here again we must avoid confusion. Not all standard language is either grammar written or taught. In all of history, one mutually understandable dialect has tended toward predominance in a given region. This kind of principal dialect was often accepted as the standard form. It was indeed written more frequently than other dialects, but not, for that reason, was it taught. Rather, diffusion occurred through a much more complex and subtle process. Midland English, for example, slowly emerged as that second, common style in which people born into any English dialect could also speak their own tongue. Quite suddenly, the language of Mughal hordes, Urdu, came into being in northern India. Within 2 generations, it became the standard in Hindustan, the trade language in a vast area, and the medium for exquisite poetry written in the Arabic and Sanskrit alphabets. Not only was this language not taught for several generations, but poets who wanted to perfect their competence explicitly avoided the study of Hindu Urdu. They explored the Persian, Arabic, or Sanskrit sources that had originally contributed to its being. In Indonesia, in half a generation of resistance to Japanese and Dutch, the militant fraternal and combative slogans, posters, and secret radios of the freedom struggle spread Malay competence into every village, and did so much more effectively than the later efforts of the Ministry of Language Control that was established after independence. It is true that the dominant position of elite or standard language was always bolstered by the technique of writing. Printing enormously enhanced the colonizing power of elite language. But to say that because printing was invented elite language is destined to supplant vernacular variety results from a debilitated imagination, like saying that after the atom bomb only superpowers shall be sovereign. The historical monopoly of educational bureaucracies over the printing press is no argument that printing techniques cannot be used to give new vitality to written expression and new literary opportunity to thousands of vernacular forms. The fact that the printing press could augment the extent and power of ungovernable vernacular readings was the source of Nebria's greatest concern and of his argument against the vernacular. The fact that printing was used since the early 16th century, but not during the first 40 years of its existence, primarily for the imposition of standard colloquials, does not mean that printed language must always be a taught form. The commercial status of taught mother tongue, call it national language, literary standard, or television language, rests largely on unexamined axioms, some of which I have already mentioned, that printing implies standardized composition, that books written in the standard language could not be easily read by people who had not been schooled in that tongue, that reading is by its very nature a silent activity that usually should be conducted in private, that enforcing a universal ability to read a few sentences and then copy them in writing increases the access of a population to the content of libraries. These and other such illusions are used to enhance the standing of teachers, the sale of rotary presses, the grading of people according to their language code and, up to now, an increase in the GNP. Vernacular spreads by practical use. It is learned from people who mean what they say and who say what they mean to the person they address in the context of everyday life. This is not so in taught language. With taught language, the one from whom I learn is not a person whom I care for or dislike, but a professional speaker. The model for taught colloquial is somebody who does not say what he means, but who recites what others have contrived. In this sense, a street vendor announcing his wares in ritual language is not a professional speaker, while the King's Herald or the clown on television are the prototypes. Taught colloquial is the language of the announcer who follows the script that an editor was told by a publicist that a board of directors had decided should be said. Taught colloquial is the dead, impersonal rhetoric of people paid to declaim with phony conviction texts composed by others, who themselves are usually paid only for designing the text. People who speak taught language imitate the announcer of news, the comedian of gag writers, the instructor following the teacher's manual to explain the textbook, the songster of engineered rhymes, or the ghostwritten president. This is language that implicitly lies when I use it to say something to your face. It is meant for the spectator who watches the scene. It is the language of farce, not of theater, the language of the hack, not of the true performer. The language of the media always seeks the appropriate audience profile that the sponsor tries to hit and to hit hard. While the vernacular is engendered in me by the intercourse between complete persons locked in conversation with each other, taught language is syntonic with loudspeakers whose assigned job is gab. The vernacular and taught mother tongue are like the two extremes on the spectrum of the colloquial. Language would be totally inhuman if it were totally taught. That is what Humboldt meant when he said that real language is speech that can only be fostered, never taught, like mathematics. Speech is much more than communication, and only machines can communicate without reference to vernacular roots. Their chatter with one another in New York now takes up about 3/4 of the lines that the telephone company operates under a franchise that guarantees access by people. This is an obvious perversion of a legal privilege that results from political aggrandizement and the degradation of vernacular domains to second-class commodities. But even more embarrassing and depressing than this abuse of a form of free speech by robots is the incidence of robot-like stock phrases that blight the remaining lines on which people presumably speak to each other. A growing percentage of speech has become mere formula in content and style. In this way, the colloquial moves on the spectrum of language increasingly from vernacular to capital-intensive communication, as if it were nothing more than the human variety of the exchange that also goes on between bees, whales, and computers. True, some vernacular elements or aspects always survive, but that is the case even for most computer programs. I do not claim that the vernacular dies, only that it withers. The American, French, or German colloquials have become composites made up of two kinds of language, commodity-like taut-uniquac and limping, ragged, jerky vernaculars struggling to survive. Taut mother tongue has established a radical monopoly over speech, just as transportation has over mobility or, more generally, commodity over vernacular values. A resistance, sometimes as strong as a sacred taboo, prevents people shaped by life in industrial society from recognizing the difference with which we are dealing. The difference between capitalized language and the vernacular, which comes at no economically measurable cost. It is the same kind of inhibition that makes it difficult for those who are brought up within the industrial system to sense the fundamental distinction between nurture from the breast and feeding by bottle, between literature and textbook, between a mile moved on my own and a passenger mile, areas where I have discussed this issue over the past years. Most people would probably be willing to admit that there is a huge difference in taste, meaning, and satisfaction between a home-cooked meal and a TV dinner. But the examination and understanding of this difference can be easily blocked, especially among those committed to equal rights, equity and service to the poor. They know how many mothers have no milk in their breasts, how many children in the South Bronx suffer protein deficiencies, how many Mexicans, surrounded by fruit trees, are crippled by vitamin deficits. As soon as I raise the distinction between vernacular values and values susceptible of economic measurement and, therefore, of being administered, some self-appointed tutor of the so-called proletariat will tell me that I am avoiding the critical issue by giving importance to non-economic niceties. Should we not seek first the just distribution of commodities that correlate to basic needs? Poetry and fishing shall then be added without more thought or effort. So goes the reading of Marx and the Gospel of St. Matthew as interpreted by the theology of liberation. A laudable intention here attempts an argument that should have been recognized as illogical in the 19th century, and that countless experiences have shown false in the 20th. So far, every single attempt to substitute a universal commodity for a vernacular value has led, not to equality, but to a hierarchical modernization of poverty. In the new dispensation, the poor are no longer those who survive by their vernacular activities because they have only marginal or no access to the market. No, the modernized poor are those whose vernacular domain, in speech and in action, is most restricted, those who get least satisfaction out of the few vernacular activities in which they can still engage. The second-level taboo which I have set out to violate is not constituted by the distinction between the vernacular and taught mother tongue, nor by the destruction of the vernacular through the radical monopoly of taught mother tongue over speech, nor even by the class-biased intensity of this vernacular paralysis. Although these three matters are far from being clearly understood today, they have been widely discussed in the recent past. The point at issue which is sedulously overlooked is quite another. Mother tongue is taught increasingly, not by paid agents, but by unpaid parents. These latter deprive their own children of the last opportunity to listen to adults who have something to say to each other. This was brought home to me clearly, some time ago, while back in New York City in an area that a few decades earlier I had known quite well, the South Bronx. I went there at the request of a young college teacher, married to a colleague. This man wanted my signature on a petition for compensatory pre-kindergarten language training for the inhabitants of a partially burned-out, high-rise slum. Twice already, quite decidedly and yet with deep embarrassment, I had refused. To overcome my resistance against this expansion of educational services, he took me on visits to brown, white, black, mostly single-parent so-called households. I saw dozens of children dashing through uninhabitable cement corridors, exposed all day to blaring television and radio in English, Spanish and even Yiddish. They seemed equally lost in language and landscape. As my friend pressed for my signature, I tried to argue for the protection of these children against further castration and inclusion in the educational sphere. We talked at cross purposes, unable to meet. And then, in the evening, at dinner in my friend's home, I suddenly understood why. This man, whom I viewed with awe because he had chosen to live in this hell, had ceased to be a parent and had become a total teacher. In front of their own children this couple stood in loco magistri. Their children had to grow up without parents, because these two adults, in every word they addressed to their two sons and one daughter, were educating them. They were at dinner constantly conscious that they were modeling the speech of their children, and they asked me to do the same. For the professional parent who engenders children as a professional lover, who volunteers his semi-professional counseling skills for neighborhood organizations, the distinction between his unpaid contribution to the managed society and what could be, in contrast, the recovery of vernacular domains, remains meaningless. He is fit prey for a new type of growth-oriented ideology, the planning and organization of an expanding shadow economy, the last frontier of arrogance which Homo economicus, energy and equity. By Ivan Illich. El socialismo puede llegar solo en bicicleta. José Antonio Vieira Gallo, Assistant Secretary of Justice in the government of Salvador Allende. Illich italicized these paragraphs prefacing Energy and Equity when he republished it in Towards a History of Needs, Berkeley, Heyday Books. This text was first published in Le Monde in early 1973. Over lunch in Paris the venerable editor of that daily, as he accepted my manuscript, recommended just one change. He felt that a term as little known and as technical as energy crisis had no place in the opening sentence of an article that he would be running on page 1. As I now reread the text, I am struck by the speed with which language and issues have shifted in less than 5 years. But I am equally struck by the slow yet steady pace at which the radical alternative to industrial society, namely, low-energy, convivial modernity, has gained defenders. In this essay I argue that under some circumstances, a technology incorporates the values of the society for which it was invented to such a degree that these values become dominant in every society which applies that technology. The material structure of production devices can thus irremediably incorporate class prejudice. High-energy technology, at least as applied to traffic, provides a clear example. Obviously, this thesis undermines the legitimacy of those professionals who monopolize the operation of such technologies. It is particularly irksome to those individuals within the professions who seek to serve the public by using the rhetoric of class struggle with the aim of replacing the capitalists who now control institutional policy by professional peers and laymen who accept professional standards. Mainly under the influence of such radical professionals, this thesis has, in only 5 years, changed from an oddity into a heresy that has provoked a barrage of abuse. The distinction proposed here, however, is not new. I oppose tools that can be applied in the generation of use values to others that cannot be used except in the production of commodities. This distinction has recently been re-emphasized by a great variety of social critics. The insistence on the need for a balance between convivial and industrial tools is, in fact, the common distinctive element in an emerging consensus among groups engaged in radical politics. A superb guide to the bibliography in this field has been published in Radical Technology, London and New York, 1976. By the editors of Undercurrents. I have transferred my own files on the theme to Valentina Boremans, who is now working on a librarian's guide to reference materials on use-value-oriented modern tools, scheduled for publication in 1978. Preliminary drafts of individual chapters of this guide can be obtained by writing to Valentina Boremans, Opto 479, Cuernavaca, Mexico. The specific argument on socially critical energy thresholds in transportation that I pursue in this essay has been elaborated and documented by two colleagues, Jean-Pierre Dupuy and Jean Robert, in their two jointly written books, La Trahison de l'Opulence, Paris, 1976, and Les Chronophages, Paris, 1978. Ivan Illich, Toward a History of Needs. Pantheon, New York, 1978. The Energy Crisis. It has recently become fashionable to insist on an impending energy crisis. This euphemistic term conceals a contradiction and consecrates an illusion. It masks the contradiction implicit in the joint pursuit of equity and industrial growth. It safeguards the illusion that machine power can indefinitely take the place of manpower. To resolve this contradiction and dispel this illusion, it is urgent to clarify the reality that the language of crisis obscures. High quanta of energy degrade social relations just as inevitably as they destroy the physical milieu. The advocates of an energy crisis believe in and continue to propagate a peculiar vision of man. According to this notion, man is born into perpetual dependence on slaves which he must painfully learn to master. If he does not employ prisoners, then he needs machines to do most of his work. According to this doctrine, The well-being of a society can be measured by the number of years its members have gone to school and by the number of energy slaves they have thereby learned to command. This belief is common to the conflicting economic ideologies now in vogue. It is threatened by the obvious inequity, harriedness, and impotence that appear everywhere once the voracious hordes of energy slaves outnumber people by a certain proportion. The energy crisis focuses concern on the scarcity of fodder for these slaves. I prefer to ask whether free men need them. The energy policies adopted during the current decade will determine the range and character of social relationships a society will be able to enjoy by the year 2000. A low-energy policy allows for a wide choice of lifestyles and cultures. If, on the other hand, a society opts for high-energy consumption, its social relations must be dictated by technocracy and will be equally degrading whether labeled capitalist or socialist. At this moment, most societies, especially the poor ones, are still free to set their energy policies by any of three guidelines. Well-being can be identified with high amounts of per capita energy use, with high efficiency of energy transformation, or with the least possible use of mechanical energy by the most powerful members of society. The first approach would stress tight management of scarce and destructive fuels on behalf of industry, whereas the second would emphasize the retooling of industry in the interest of thermodynamic thrift. These first two attitudes necessarily imply huge public expenditures and increased social control. Both rationalize the emergence of a computerized leviathan, and both are at present widely discussed. The possibility of a third option is barely noticed. While people have begun to accept ecological limits on maximum per capita energy use as a condition for physical survival, they do not yet think about the use of minimum feasible power as the foundation of any of various social orders that would be both modern and desirable. Yet only a ceiling on energy use can lead to social relations that are characterized by high levels of equity. The one option that is at present neglected is the only choice within the reach of all nations. It is also the only strategy by which a political process can be used to set limits on the power of even the most motorized bureaucrat. Participatory democracy postulates low-energy technology. Only participatory democracy creates the conditions for rational technology. What is generally overlooked is that equity and energy can grow concurrently only to a point. Below a threshold of per capita wattage, motors improve the conditions for social progress. Above this threshold, energy grows at the expense of equity. Further energy affluence then means decreased distribution of control over that energy. The widespread belief that clean and abundant energy is the panacea for social ills is due to a political fallacy, according to which equity and energy consumption can be indefinitely correlated, at least under some ideal political conditions. Laboring under this illusion, we tend to discount any social limit on the growth of energy consumption. But if ecologists are right to assert that non-metabolic power pollutes, it is in fact just as inevitable that, beyond a certain threshold, mechanical power corrupts. The threshold of social disintegration by high energy quanta is independent from the threshold at which energy conversion produces physical destruction. Expressed in horsepower, it is undoubtedly lower. This is the fact which must be theoretically recognized before a political issue can be made of the per capita wattage to which a society will limit its members. Even if non-polluting power were feasible and abundant, the use of energy on a massive scale acts on society like a drug that is physically harmless but psychically enslaving. A community can choose between methadone and cold turkey between maintaining its addiction to alien energy and kicking it in painful cramps, but no society can have a population that is hooked on progressively larger numbers of energy slaves and whose members are also autonomously active. In previous discussions, I have shown that, beyond a certain level of per capita GNP, the cost of social control must rise faster than total output and become the major institutional activity within an economy. Therapy administered by educators, psychiatrists, and social workers must converge with the designs of planners, managers, and salesmen, and complement the services of security agencies, the military, and the police. I now want to indicate one reason why increased affluence requires increased control over people. I argue that beyond a certain median per capita energy level, the political system and cultural context of any society must decay. Once the critical quantum of per capita energy is surpassed, education for the abstract goals of a bureaucracy must supplant the legal guarantees of personal and concrete initiative. This quantum is the limit of social order. I will argue here that technocracy must prevail as soon as the ratio of mechanical power to metabolic energy oversteps a definite, identifiable threshold. The order of magnitude within which this threshold lies is largely independent of the level of technology applied, yet its very existence has slipped into the blind spot of social imagination in both rich and medium-rich countries. Both the United States and Mexico have passed the critical divide. In both countries, Further energy inputs increase inequality, inefficiency, and personal impotence. Although one country has a per capita income of $500 and the other, one of nearly $5,000, huge vested interest in an industrial infrastructure prods both of them to further escalate the use of energy. As a result, both North American and Mexican ideologues put the label of energy crisis on their frustration, and both countries are blinded to the fact that the threat of social breakdown is due neither to a shortage of fuel nor to the wasteful, polluting, and irrational use of available wattage, but to the attempt of industries to gorge society with energy quanta that inevitably degrade, deprive, and frustrate most people. A people can be just as dangerously overpowered by the wattage of its tools as by the caloric content of its foods, but it is much harder to confess to a national overindulgence in wattage than to a sickening diet. The per capita wattage that is critical for social well-being lies within an order of magnitude which is far above the horsepower known to 4/5 of humanity and far below the power commanded by any Volkswagen driver. It eludes the underconsumer and the overconsumer alike. Neither is willing to face the facts. For the primitive, the elimination of slavery and drudgery depends on the introduction of appropriate modern technology, and for the rich, the avoidance of an even more horrible degradation depends on the effective recognition of a threshold in energy consumption beyond which technical processes begin to dictate social relations. Calories are both biologically and socially healthy only as long as they stay within the narrow range that separates enough from too much. The so-called energy crisis is, then, a politically ambiguous issue. Public interest in the quantity of power and in the distribution of controls over the use of energy can lead in two opposite directions. On the one hand, questions can be posed that would open the way to political reconstruction by unblocking the search for a post-industrial, labor-intensive, low-energy and high-equity economy. On the other hand, hysterical concern with machine fodder can reinforce the present escalation of capital-intensive institutional growth, and carry us past the last turnoff from a hyper-industrial Armageddon. Political reconstruction presupposes the recognition of the fact that there exist critical per capita quanta beyond which energy can no longer be controlled by political process. A universal social straitjacket will be the inevitable outcome of ecological restraints on total energy use imposed by industrial-minded planners bent on keeping industrial production at some hypothetical maximum. Rich countries like the United States, Japan, or France might never reach the point of choking on their own waste, but only because their societies will have already collapsed into a socio-cultural energy coma. Countries like India, Burma, and, for another short while at least, China are in the inverse position of being still muscle-powered enough to stop short of an energy stroke. They could choose, right now, to stay within those limits to which the rich will be forced back through a total loss of their freedoms. The choice of a minimum energy economy compels the poor to abandon fantastical expectations and the rich to recognize their vested interest as a ghastly liability. Both must reject the fatal image of man the slaveholder currently promoted by an ideologically stimulated hunger for more energy. In countries that were made affluent by industrial development, the energy crisis serves as a pretext for raising the taxes that will be needed to substitute new, more rational, and socially more deadly industrial processes for those that have been rendered obsolete by inefficient overexpansion. For the leaders of people who are not yet dominated by the same process of industrialization, the energy crisis serves as a historical imperative to centralize production, pollution, and their control in a last-ditch effort to catch up with the more highly powered. By exporting their crisis and by preaching the new gospel of Puritan energy worship, the rich do even more damage to the poor than they did by selling them the products of now outdated factories. As soon as a poor country accepts the doctrine that more energy more carefully managed will always yield more goods for more people, that country locks itself into the cage of enslavement to maximum industrial outputs. Inevitably the poor lose the option for rational technology when they choose to modernize their poverty by increasing their dependence on energy. Inevitably the poor deny themselves the possibility of liberating technology and participatory politics when, together with maximum feasible energy use, they accept maximum feasible social control. The energy crisis cannot be overwhelmed by more energy inputs. It can only be dissolved, along with the illusion that well-being depends on the number of energy slaves a man has at his command. For this purpose, it is necessary to identify the thresholds beyond which energy corrupts, and to do so by a political process that associates the community in the search for limits. Because this kind of research runs counter to that now done by experts and for institutions, I shall continue to call it counterfoil research. It has 3 steps. First, the need for limits on the per capita use of energy must be theoretically recognized as a social imperative. Then, the range must be located wherein the critical magnitude might be found. Finally, each community has to identify the levels of inequity, harrying, and operant conditioning that its members are willing to accept in exchange for the satisfaction that comes of idolizing powerful devices and joining in rituals directed by the professionals who control their operation. The need for political research on socially optimal energy quanta can be clearly and concisely illustrated by an examination of modern traffic. The United States puts between 25 and 45% of its total energy, depending upon how one calculates this, into vehicles, to make them, run them, and clear a right-of-way for them when they roll, when they fly, and when they park. Most of this energy is to move people who have been strapped into place. For the sole purpose of transporting people, 250 million Americans allocate more fuel than is used by 1.3 billion Chinese and Indians for all purposes. Almost all of this fuel is burned in a rain dance of time-consuming acceleration. Poor countries spend less energy per person, but the percentage of total energy devoted to traffic in Mexico or in Peru is probably greater than in the United States, and it benefits a smaller percentage of the population. The size of this enterprise makes it both easy and significant to demonstrate the existence of socially critical energy quanta by the example of personal mobility. In traffic, energy used over a specific period of time, power, translates into speed. In this case, the critical quantum will appear as a speed limit. Wherever this limit has been passed, the basic pattern of social degradation by high energy quanta has emerged. Once some public utility went faster than 15 miles per hour, equity declined and the scarcity of both time and space increased. Motorized transportation monopolized traffic and blocked self-powered transit. In every Western country, passenger mileage on all types of conveyance increased by a factor of 100 within 50 years of building the first railroad. When the ratio of their respective power outputs passed beyond a certain value, mechanical transformers of mineral fuels excluded people from the use of their metabolic energy and forced them to become captive consumers of conveyance. This effect of speed on the autonomy of people is only marginally affected by the technological characteristics of the motorized vehicles employed or by the persons or entities who hold the legal titles to airlines, buses, railroads, or cars. High speed is the critical factor which makes transportation socially destructive. A true choice among practical policies and of desirable social relations is possible only where speed is restrained. Participatory democracy demands low-energy technology, and free people must travel the road to productive social relations at the speed of a bicycle. The industrialization of traffic. The discussion of how energy is used to move people requires a formal distinction between transport and transit as the two components of traffic. By traffic I mean any movement of people from one place to another when they are outside their homes. By transit I mean those movements that put human metabolic energy to use, and by transport, that mode of movement which relies on other sources of energy. These energy sources will henceforth be mostly motors, since animals compete fiercely with men for their food in an overpopulated world, unless they are thistle eaters like donkeys and camels. As soon as people become tributaries of transport, not just when they travel for several days, but also on their daily trips, the contradictions between social justice and motorized power, between effective movement and higher speed, between personal freedom and engineered routing, become poignantly clear. Enforced dependence on automobile machines then denies a community of self-propelled people just those values supposedly procured by improved transportation. People move well on their feet. This primitive means of getting around will, on closer analysis, appear quite effective when compared with the lot of people in modern cities or on industrialized farms. It will appear particularly attractive once it has been understood that modern Americans walk, on the average, as many miles as their ancestors, most of them through tunnels, corridors, parking lots, and stores. People on their feet are more or less equal. People solely dependent on their feet move on the spur of the moment, at 3 to 4 miles per hour, in any direction and to any place from which they are not legally or physically barred. An improvement on this native degree of mobility by new transport technology should be expected to safeguard these values and to add some new ones, such as greater range, time economies, comfort, or more opportunities for the disabled. So far this is not what has happened. Instead, the growth of the transportation industry has everywhere had the reverse effect. From the moment its machines could put more than a certain horsepower behind any one passenger, this industry has reduced equality among men, restricted their mobility to a system of industrially defined routes, and created time scarcity of unprecedented severity. As the speed of their vehicles crosses a threshold, citizens become transportation consumers on the daily loop that brings them back to their home, a circuit which the United States Department of Commerce calls a trip as opposed to the travel for which Americans leave home equipped with a toothbrush. More energy fed into the transportation system means that more people move faster over a greater range in the course of every day. Everybody's daily radius expands at the expense of being able to drop in on an acquaintance or walk through the park on the way to work. Extremes of privilege are created at the cost of universal enslavement. An elite packs unlimited distance into a lifetime of pampered travel, while the majority spend a bigger slice of their existence on unwanted trips. The few mount their magic carpets to travel between distant points that their ephemeral presence renders both scarce and seductive, while the many are compelled to trip farther and faster and to spend more time preparing for and recovering from their trips. In the United States, 4/5 of all man-hours on the road are those of commuters and shoppers who hardly ever get into a plane, while 4/5 of the mileage flown to conventions and resorts is covered year after year by the same 1.5% of the population, usually those who are either well-to-do or professionally trained to do good. The speedier the vehicle, the larger the subsidy it gets from regressive taxation. Barely 0.2% of the entire United States population can engage in self-chosen air travel more than once a year, and few other countries can support a jet set which is that large. The captive tripper and the reckless traveler become equally dependent on transport. Neither can do without it. Occasional spurts to Acapulco or to a party congress dupe the ordinary passenger into believing that he has made it into the shrunk world of the powerfully rushed. The occasional chance to spend a few hours strapped into a high-powered seat makes him an accomplice in the distortion of human space, and prompts him to consent to the design of his country's geography around vehicles rather than around people. Man has evolved physically and culturally together with his cosmic niche. What for animals is their environment he has learned to make into his home. His self-consciousness requires as its complement a life space and a lifetime integrated by the pace at which he moves. If that relationship is determined by the velocity of vehicles rather than by the movement of people, man the architect is reduced to the status of a mere commuter. The model American male devotes more than 1,600 hours a year to his car. He sits in it while it goes and while it stands idling. He parks it and searches for it. He earns the money to put down on it and to meet the monthly installments. He works to pay for gasoline, tolls, insurance, taxes, and tickets. He spends 4 of his 16 waking hours on the road or gathering his resources for it. And this figure does not take into account the time consumed by other activities dictated by transport, time spent in hospitals, traffic courts, and garages, time spent watching automobile commercials or attending consumer education meetings to improve the quality of the next buy. The model American puts in 1,600 hours to get 7,500 miles, less than 5 miles per hour. In countries deprived of a transportation industry, people manage to do the same, walking wherever they want to go, and they allocate only 3 to 8% of their society's time budget to traffic instead of 28%. What distinguishes the traffic in rich countries from the traffic in poor countries is not more mileage per hour of lifetime for the majority, but more hours of compulsory consumption of high doses of energy, packaged and unequally distributed by the transportation industry. Speed stunned imagination. Past a certain threshold of energy consumption, the transportation industry dictates the configuration of social space. Motorways expand, driving wedges between neighbors and removing fields beyond the distance a farmer can walk. Ambulances take clinics beyond the few miles a sick child can be carried. The doctor will no longer come to the house, because vehicles have made the hospital into the right place to be sick. Once heavy trucks reach a village high in the Andes, part of the local market disappears. Later, when the high school arrives at the plaza along with the paved highway, more and more of the young people move to the city, until not one family is left which does not long for a reunion with someone hundreds of miles away, down on the coast. Equal speeds have equally distorting effects on the perception of space, time, and personal potency in rich and in poor countries, however different the surface appearances might be. Everywhere, the transportation industry shapes a new kind of man to fit the new geography and the new schedules of its making. The major difference between Guatemala and Kansas is that in Central America some provinces are still exempt from all contact with vehicles and are, therefore, still not degraded by their dependence on them. The product of the transportation industry is the habitual passenger. He has been boosted out of the world in which people still move on their own, and he has lost the sense that he stands at the center of his world. The habitual passenger is conscious of the exasperating time scarcity that results from daily recourse to the cars, trains, buses, subways, and elevators that force him to cover an average of 20 miles each day, frequently crisscrossing his path within a radius of less than 5 miles. He has been lifted off his feet. No matter if he goes by subway or jet plane, he feels slower and poorer than someone else and resents the shortcuts taken by the privileged few who can escape the frustrations of traffic. If he is cramped by the timetable of his commuter train, he dreams of a car. If he drives, exhausted by the rush hour, he He envies the speed capitalist who drives against the traffic. If he must pay for his car out of his own pocket, he knows full well that the commanders of corporate fleets send the fuel bill to the company and write off the rented car as a business expense. The habitual passenger is caught at the wrong end of growing inequality, time scarcity, and personal impotence, but he can see no way out of this bind except to demand more of the same, more traffic by transport. He stands in wait for technical changes in the design of vehicles, roads, and schedules, or else he expects a revolution to produce mass rapid transport under public control. In neither case does he calculate the price of being hauled into a better future. He forgets that he is the one who will pay the bill, either in fares or in taxes. He overlooks the hidden costs of replacing private cars with equally rapid public transport. The habitual passenger cannot grasp the folly of traffic based overwhelmingly on transport. His inherited perceptions of space and time and of personal pace have been industrially deformed. He has lost the power to conceive of himself outside the passenger role. Addicted to being carried along, he has lost control over the physical, social, and psychic powers that reside in man's feet. The passenger has come to identify territory with the untouchable landscape through which he has rushed. He has become impotent to establish his domain, mark it with his imprint, and assert his sovereignty over it. He has lost confidence in his power to admit others into his presence and to share space consciously with them. He can no longer face the remote by himself. Left on his own, he feels immobile. The habitual passenger must adopt a new set of beliefs and expectations if he is to feel secure in the strange world where both liaisons and loneliness are products of conveyance. To gather for him means to be brought together by vehicles. He comes to believe that political power grows out of the capacity of a transportation system, and in its absence is the result of access to the television screen. He takes freedom of movement to be the same as one's claim on propulsion. He believes that the level of democratic process correlates to the power of transportation and communications systems. He has lost faith in the political power of the feet and of the tongue. As a result, what he wants is not more liberty as a citizen but better service as a client. He does not insist on his freedom to move and to speak to people but on his claim to be shipped and to be informed by media. He wants a better product rather than freedom from servitude to it. It is vital that he come to see that the acceleration he demands is self-defeating, and that it must result in a further decline of equity, leisure, and autonomy. Net transfer of lifetime. Unchecked speed is expensive, and progressively fewer can afford it. Each increment in the velocity of a vehicle results in an increase in the cost of propulsion and track construction and, most dramatically, in the space the vehicle devours while it is on the move. Past a certain threshold of energy consumption for the fastest passenger, a worldwide class structure of speed capitalists is created. The exchange value of time becomes dominant, and this is reflected in language. Time is spent, saved, invested, wasted, and employed. As societies put price tags on time, equity and vehicular speed correlate inversely. High speed capitalizes a few people's time at an enormous rate but, paradoxically, it does this at a high cost in time for all. In Bombay, only a very few people own cars. They can reach a provincial capital in one morning and make the trip once a week. 2 generations ago, this would have been a week-long trek once a year. They now spend more time on more trips. But these same few also disrupt, with their cars, the traffic flow of thousands of bicycles and pedicabs that move through downtown Bombay at a rate of effective locomotion that is still superior to that of downtown Paris, London, or New York. The compounded, transport-related time expenditure within a society grows much faster than the time economies made by a few people on their speedy excursions. Traffic grows indefinitely with the availability of high-speed transports. Beyond a critical threshold, the output of the industrial complex established to move people costs a society more time than it saves. The marginal utility of an increment in the speed of a small number of people has for its price the growing marginal disutility of this acceleration for the great majority. Beyond a critical speed, no one can save time without forcing another to lose it. The man who claims a seat in a faster vehicle insists that his time is worth more than that of the passenger in a slower one. Beyond a certain velocity, passengers become consumers of other people's time, and accelerating vehicles become the means for effecting a net transfer of lifetime. The degree of transfer is measured in quanta of speed. This time grab despoils those who are left behind, and since they are the majority, it raises ethical issues of a more general nature than the lottery that assigns kidney dialysis or organ transplants. Beyond a certain speed, motorized vehicles create remoteness which they alone can shrink. They create distances for all and shrink them for only a few. A new dirt road through the wilderness brings the city within view, but not within reach, of most Brazilian subsistence farmers. The new expressway expands Chicago, but it sucks those who are well-wheeled away from a downtown that decays into a ghetto. Contrary to what is often claimed, man's speed remained unchanged from the age of Cyrus to the age of steam. News did not travel more than 100 miles per day, no matter how the message was carried. Neither the Inca's runners nor the Venetian galley, the Persian horseman, or the mail coach on regular runs under Louis XIV broke the barrier. Soldiers, explorers, merchants, and pilgrims moved at 20 miles per day. In Valerie's words, Napoleon still had to move at Caesar's slowness. Napoleon va à la même lenteur que Caesar. The emperor knew that public prosperity is measured by the income of the coaches, on mesure la prospérité publique au compte des diligences, but he could barely speed them up. Paris, Toulouse had required about 200 hours in Roman times, and the scheduled stagecoach still took 158 hours in 1740, before the opening of the new royal roads. Only the 19th century accelerated man. By 1830, the trip had been reduced to 110 hours, but at a new cost. In the same year, 4,150 stagecoaches overturned in France, causing more than 1,000 deaths. Then the railroad brought a sudden change. By 1855, Napoleon III claimed to have hit 96 km per hour on the train somewhere between Paris and Marseille. Within one generation, the average distance traveled each year per Frenchman increased 130 times, and Britain's railroad network reached its greatest expansion. Passenger trains attained their optimum cost calculated in terms of time spent for their maintenance and use. With further acceleration, transportation began to dominate traffic, and speed began to erect a hierarchy of destinations. By now, each set of destinations corresponds to a specific level of speed and defines a certain passenger class. Each circuit of terminal points degrades those pegged at a lower number of miles per hour. Those who must get around on their own power have been redefined as underdeveloped outsiders. Tell me how fast you go and I'll tell you who you are. If you can corner the taxes that fuel the Concorde, you are certainly at the top. Over the last 2 generations, the vehicle has become the sign of career achievement, just as the school has become the sign of starting advantage. At each new level, the concentration of power must produce its own kind of rationale. So, for example, the reason that is usually given for spending public money to make a man travel more miles in less time each year is the still greater investment that was made to keep him more years in school. His putative value as a capital-intensive production tool sets the rate at which he is being shipped. Other ideological labels besides a good education are just as useful for opening the cabin door to luxuries paid for by others. If the thought of Chairman Mao must now be rushed around China by jet, this can only mean that 2 classes are needed to fuel what his revolution has become, one of them living in the geography of the masses and the other in the geography of the cadres. The suppression of intermediary levels of speed in the People's Republic has certainly made the concentration of power more efficient and rational, but it also underscores the new difference in value between the time of the bullock driver and the time of the jet-driven. Acceleration inevitably concentrates horsepower onto the seats of a few and compounds the increasing time lack of most commuters with the further sense that they are lagging behind. The need for unequal privilege in an industrial society is generally advocated by means of an argument with 2 sides. The hypocrisy of this argument is clearly betrayed by acceleration. Privilege is accepted as the necessary precondition for improving the lot of a growing total population, or it is advertised as the instrument for raising the standards of a deprived minority. In the long run, accelerating transportation does neither. It only creates a universal demand for motorized conveyance and puts previously unimaginable distances between the various layers of privilege. Beyond a certain point, more energy means less equity. The ineffectiveness of acceleration. It should not be overlooked that top speeds for a few exact a different price than high speeds for all. Social classification by levels of speed enforces a net transfer of power. The poor work and pay to get left behind. But if the middle classes of a speed society may be tempted to ignore discrimination, they should not neglect the rising marginal disutilities of transportation and their own loss of leisure. High speeds for all mean that everybody has less time for himself as the whole society spends a growing slice of its time budget on moving people. Vehicles running over the critical speed not only tend to impose inequality, they also inevitably establish a self-serving industry that hides an inefficient system of locomotion under apparent technological sophistication. I will argue that a speed limit is not only necessary to safeguard equity, it is equally a condition for increasing the total distance traveled within a society, while simultaneously decreasing the sum total of lifetime that transportation claims. There is little research available on the impact of vehicles on the 24-hour time budget of individuals and societies. From transportation studies, we get statistics on the cost of time per mile, on the value of time measured in dollars or in length of trips. But these statistics tell us nothing about the hidden costs of transportation, about how traffic nibbles away at lifetime, about how vehicles devour space, about the multiplication of trips made necessary by the existence of vehicles, or about the time spent directly and indirectly preparing for locomotion. Further, there is no available measure of the even more deeply buried costs of transport, such as higher rent to live in areas convenient to the flow of traffic, or the cost of protecting these areas from the noise, pollution, and danger to life and limb that vehicles create. The lack of an account of expenditures from the social time budget should not lead us to believe, however, that such an accounting is impossible, nor should it prevent our drawing conclusions from the little that we do know. From our limited information it appears that everywhere in the world, after some vehicle broke the speed barrier of 15 miles per hour, time scarcity related to traffic began to grow. After industry had reached this threshold of per capita output, transport made of man a new kind of waif, a being constantly absent from a destination he cannot reach on his own but must attain within the day. By now, people work a substantial part of every day to earn the money without which they could not even get to work. The time a society spends on transportation grows in proportion to the speed of its fastest public conveyance. Japan now leads the United States in both areas. Lifetime gets cluttered up with activities generated by traffic as soon as vehicles crash through the barrier that guards people from dislocation and space from distortion. Whether the vehicle that speeds along the public freeway is owned by the state or by an individual has little to do with the time scarcity and overprogramming that rise with every increment in speed. Buses use 1/3 of the fuel that cars burn to carry one man over a given distance. Commuter trains are up to 10 times more efficient than cars. Both could become even more efficient and less polluting. If publicly owned and rationally managed, they could be so scheduled and routed that the privileges they now provide under private ownership and incompetent organization would be considerably cut. But as long as any system of vehicles imposes itself on the public by top speeds that are not under political control, the public is left to choose between spending more time to pay for more people to be carried from station to station, and paying less taxes so that even fewer people can travel in much less time much farther than others. The order of magnitude of the top speed that is permitted within a transportation system determines the slice of its time budget that an entire society spends on traffic. The radical monopoly of industry. A desirable ceiling on the velocity of movement cannot be usefully discussed without returning to the distinction between self-powered transit and motorized transport, and comparing the contribution each component makes relative to the total locomotion of people, which I have called traffic. Transport stands for the capital-intensive mode of traffic, and transit indicates the labor-intensive mode. Transport is the product of an industry whose clients are passengers. It is an industrial commodity and therefore scarce by definition. Improvement of transport always takes place under conditions of scarcity that become more severe as the speed, and with it the cost, of the service increases. Conflict about insufficient transport tends to take the form of a zero-sum game where one wins only if another loses. At best, such a conflict allows for the optimum in the prisoner's dilemma. By cooperating with their jailer, both prisoners get off with less time in the cell. Transit is not the product of an industry but the independent enterprise of transients. It has use value by definition but need not have any exchange value. The ability to engage in transit is native to man and more or less equally distributed among healthy people of the same age. The exercise of this ability can be restricted by depriving some class of people of the right to take a straight route, or because a population lacks shoes or pavements. Conflict about unsatisfactory transit conditions tends to take, therefore, the form of a non-zero-sum game in which everyone comes out ahead, not only the people who get the right to walk through a formally walled property, but also those who live along the road. Total traffic is the result of two profoundly distinct modes of production. These can reinforce each other harmoniously only as long as the autonomous outputs are protected against the encroachment of the industrial product. The harm done by contemporary traffic is due to the monopoly of transport. The allure of speed has deceived the passenger into accepting the promises made by an industry that produces capital-intensive traffic. He is convinced that high-speed vehicles have allowed him to progress beyond the limited autonomy he enjoyed when moving under his own power. He has allowed planned transport to predominate over the alternative of labor-intensive transit. Destruction of the physical environment is the least noxious effect of this concession. The far more bitter results are the multiplication of psychic frustration, the growing disutilities of continued production, and subjection to an inequitable transfer of power, all of which are manifestations of a distorted relationship between lifetime and life-space. The passenger who agrees to live in a world monopolized by transport becomes a harassed, overburdened consumer of distances whose shape and length he can no longer control. Every society that imposes compulsory speed submerges transit to the profit of transport. wherever not only privilege but also elementary necessities are denied to those who do not use high-speed conveyances, an involuntary acceleration of personal rhythms is imposed. Industry dominates traffic as soon as daily life comes to depend on motorized trips. This profound control of the transportation industry over natural mobility constitutes a monopoly much more pervasive than either the commercial monopoly Ford might win over the automobile market, or the political monopoly car manufacturers might wield against the development of trains and buses. Because of its hidden, entrenched, and structuring nature, I call this a radical monopoly. Any industry exercises this kind of deep-seated monopoly when it becomes the dominant means of satisfying needs that formerly occasioned a personal response. The compulsory consumption of a high-powered commodity, motorized transport, restricts the conditions for enjoying an abundant use value, the innate capacity for transit. Traffic serves here as the paradigm of a general economic law. Any industrial product that comes in per capita quanta beyond a given intensity exercises a radical monopoly over the satisfaction of a need. Beyond some point, compulsory schooling destroys the environment for learning, medical delivery systems dry up the non-therapeutic sources of health, and transportation smothers traffic. Radical monopoly is first established by a rearrangement of society for the benefit of those who have access to the larger quanta, then it is enforced by compelling all to consume the minimum quantum in which the output is currently produced. Compulsory consumption will take on a different appearance in industrial branches where information dominates, such as education or medicine, than it will in those branches where quanta can be measured in British thermal units, such as housing, clothing, or transport. The industrial packaging of values will reach critical intensity at different points with different products, but for each major class of outputs, the threshold occurs within an order of magnitude that is theoretically identifiable. The fact that it is possible theoretically to determine the range of speed within which transportation develops a radical monopoly over traffic does not mean that it is possible theoretically to determine just how much of such a monopoly any given society will tolerate. The fact that it is possible to identify a level of compulsory instruction at which learning by seeing and doing declines does not enable the theorist to identify the specific pedagogical limits to the division of labor that a culture will tolerate. Only recourse to juridical and, above all, to political process can lead to the specific, though provisional, measures by which speed or compulsory education will actually be limited in a given society. The magnitude of voluntary limits is a matter of politics. The encroachment of radical monopoly can be pinpointed by social analysis. A branch of industry does not impose a radical monopoly on a whole society by the simple fact that it produces scarce products, or by driving competing industries off the market, but rather by virtue of its acquired ability to create and shape the need which it alone can satisfy. Shoes are scarce all over Latin America, and many people never wear them. They walk on the bare soles of their feet, or wear the world's widest variety of excellent sandals, supplied by a range of artisans. Their transit is in no way restricted by their lack of shoes. But in some countries of South America people are compelled to be shod ever since access to schools, jobs, and public services was denied to the barefoot. Teachers or party officials define the lack of shoes as a sign of indifference toward progress. Without any intentional conspiracy between the promoters of national development and the shoe industry, the barefoot in these countries are now barred from any office. Schools, like shoes, have been scarce at all times. But it was never the small number of privileged pupils that turned the school into an obstacle for learning. Only when laws were enacted to make schools both compulsory and free did the educator assume the power to deny learning opportunities on the job to the under-consumer of educational therapies. Only when school attendance had become obligatory did it become feasible to impose on all a progressively more complex artificial environment into which the unschooled and unprogrammed do not fit. The potential of a radical monopoly is unmistakable in the case of traffic. Imagine what would happen if the transportation industry could somehow distribute its output more adequately. A traffic utopia of free rapid transportation for all would inevitably lead to a further expansion of traffic's domain over human life. What would such a utopia look like? Traffic would be organized exclusively around public transportation systems. It would be financed by a progressive tax calculated on income and on the proximity of one's residence to the next terminal and to the job. It would be designed so that everybody could occupy any seat on a first-come, first-served basis. The doctor, the vacationer, and the president would not be assigned any priority of person. In this fool's paradise, all passengers would be equal, but they would be just as equally captive consumers of transport. Each citizen of a motorized utopia would be equally deprived of the use of his feet and equally drafted into the servitude of proliferating networks of transportation. Certain would-be miracle makers disguised as architects offer a specious escape from the paradox of speed. By their standards, acceleration imposes inequities, time loss, and controlled schedules only because people do not yet live in those patterns and orbits into which vehicles can best place them. These futuristic architects would house and occupy people in self-sufficient units of towers interconnected by tracks for high-speed capsules. Solari, Doxiadis, or Fuller would solve the problem created by high-speed transport by identifying the entire human habitat with the problem. Rather than asking how the Earth's surface can be preserved for people, they ask how reservations necessary for the survival of people can be established on an Earth that has been reshaped for the sake of industrial outputs. The elusive threshold. Paradoxically, the concept of a traffic optimal top speed for transport seems capricious or fanatical to the confirmed passenger, whereas it looks like the flight of the bird to the donkey driver. 4 or 6 times the speed of a man on foot constitutes a threshold too low to be deemed worthy of consideration by the habitual passenger and too high to convey the sense of a limit to the 3/4 of humanity who still get around on their own power. All those who plan, finance, or engineer other people's housing, transportation, or education, belong to the passenger class. Their claim to power is derived from the value their employers place on acceleration. Social scientists can build a computer model of traffic in Calcutta or Santiago, and engineers can design monorail webs according to abstract notions of traffic flow. Since these planners are true believers in problem-solving by industrial design, the real solution for traffic congestion is beyond their grasp. Their belief in the effectiveness of power blinds them to the disproportionately greater effectiveness of abstaining from its use. Traffic engineers have yet to combine in one simulation model the mobility of people with that of vehicles. The transportation engineer cannot conceive of the possibility of renouncing speed and slowing down for the sake of permitting time and destination optimal traffic flow. He would never entertain the thought of programming his computer on the stipulation that no motorized vehicle within any city should ever overtake the speed of a velocipede. The development expert who looks down compassionately from his Land Rover on the Indian peasant herding his pigs to market refuses to acknowledge the relative advantage of feet. The expert tends to forget that this man has dispensed 10 others in his village from spending time on the road, whereas the engineer and every member of his family separately devote a major part of every day to transportation. For a man who believes that human mobility must be conceived in terms of indefinite progress, there can be no optimal level of traffic but only passing consensus on a given technical level of transportation. Most Mexicans, not to speak of Indians and Chinese, are in a position inverse to that of the confirmed passenger. The critical threshold is entirely beyond what all but a few of them know or expect. They still belong to the class of the self-powered. Some of them have a lingering memory of a motorized adventure, but most of them have no personal experience of traveling at or above the critical speed. In the 2 typical Mexican states of Guerrero and Chiapas, less than 1% of the population moved even once over 10 miles in less than 1 hour during 1970. The vehicles into which people in these areas are sometimes crowded render traffic indeed more convenient, but barely faster than the speed of a bicycle. The third-class bus does not separate the farmer from his pig, and it takes them both to market without inflicting any loss of weight, but this acquaintance with motorized comfort does not amount to dependence on destructive speed. The order of magnitude in which the critical threshold of speed can be found is too low to be taken seriously by the passenger, and too high to concern the peasant. It is so obvious it cannot be easily seen. The proposal of a limit to speed within this order of magnitude engenders stubborn opposition. It exposes the addiction of industrialized man to ever higher doses of energy, while it asks those who are still sober to abstain from something they have yet to taste. To propose counterfoil research is not only a scandal, it is also a threat. Simplicity threatens the expert, who supposedly understands just why the commuter train runs at 8:15 and 8:41 and why it must be better to use fuel with certain additives. That a political process could identify a natural dimension, both inescapable and limited, is an idea that lies outside the passenger's world of verities. He has let respect for specialists he does not even know turn into unthinking submission. If a political resolution could be found for problems created by experts in the field of traffic, then perhaps the same remedy could be applied to problems of education, medicine, or urbanization. If the order of magnitude of traffic optimal vehicular velocities could be determined by laymen actively participating in an ongoing political process, then the foundation on which the framework of every industrial society is built would be shattered. To propose such research is politically subversive. It calls in question the overarching consensus on the need for more transportation which now allows the proponents of public ownership to define themselves as political adversaries of the proponents of private enterprise. Degrees of self-powered mobility. A century ago, the ball bearing was invented. It reduced the coefficient of friction by a factor of 1,000. By applying a well-calibrated ball bearing between two Neolithic millstones, a man could now grind in a day what took his ancestors a week. The ball bearing also made possible the bicycle, allowing the wheel, probably the last of the great Neolithic inventions, finally to become useful for self-powered mobility. Man, unaided by any tool, gets around quite efficiently. He carries 1 gram of his weight over a kilometer in 10 minutes by expending 0.75 calories. Man on his feet is thermodynamically more efficient than any motorized vehicle and most animals. For his weight, he performs more work in locomotion than rats or oxen, less than horses or sturgeon. At this rate of efficiency man settled the world and made its history. At this rate peasant societies spend less than 5% and nomads less than 8% of their respective social time budgets outside the home or the encampment. Man on a bicycle can go 3 or 4 times faster than the pedestrian, but uses 5 times less energy in the process. He carries 1 gram of his weight over a kilometer of flat road at an expense of only 0.15 calories. The bicycle is the perfect transducer to match man's metabolic energy to the impedance of locomotion. Equipped with this tool, man outstrips the efficiency of not only all machines but all other animals as well. The invention of the ball bearing, the tangent-spoked wheel, and the pneumatic tire taken together can be compared to only 3 other events in the history of transportation. The invention of the wheel at the dawn of civilization took the load off man's back and put it onto the barrow. The invention and simultaneous application, during the European Middle Ages, of stirrup, shoulder harness, and horseshoe increased the thermodynamic efficiency of the horse by a factor of up to 5, and changed the economy of medieval Europe. It made frequent plowing possible and thus introduced rotation agriculture. It brought more distant fields into the reach of the peasant, and thus permitted landowners to move from 6-family hamlets into 100-family villages, where they could live around the church, the square, the jail, and, later, the school. It allowed the cultivation of northern soils and shifted the center of power into cold climates. The building of the first ocean-going vessels by the Portuguese in the 15th century, under the aegis of developing European capitalism, laid the solid foundations for a globe-spanning culture and market. The invention of the ball bearing signaled a fourth revolution. This revolution was unlike that, supported by the stirrup, which raised the knight onto his horse, and unlike that, supported by the galleon, which enlarged the horizon of the king's captains. The ball bearing signaled a true crisis, a true political choice. It created an option between more freedom and equity and more speed. The bearing is an equally fundamental ingredient of 2 new types of locomotion, respectively symbolized by the bicycle and the car. The bicycle lifted man's automobility into a new order, beyond which progress is theoretically not possible. In contrast, the accelerating individual capsule enabled societies to engage in a ritual of progressively paralyzing speed. The monopoly of a ritual application over a potentially useful device is nothing new. Thousands of years ago, the wheel took the load off the carrier slave, but it did so only on the Eurasian landmass. In Mexico, the wheel was well known, but never applied to transport. It served exclusively for the construction of carriages for toy gods. The taboo on wheelbarrows in America before Cortes is no more puzzling than the taboo on bicycles in modern traffic. It is by no means necessary that the invention of the ball bearing continue to serve the increase of energy use and thereby produce time scarcity, space consumption, and class privilege. If the new order of self-powered mobility offered by the bicycle were protected against devaluation, paralysis, and risk to the limbs of the rider, it would be possible to guarantee optimal shared mobility to all people and put an end to the imposition of maximum privilege and exploitation. It would be possible to control the patterns of urbanization if the organization of space were constrained by the power man has to move through it. Bicycles are not only thermodynamically efficient, they are also cheap. With his much lower salary, the Chinese acquires his durable bicycle in a fraction of the working hours an American devotes to the purchase of his obsolescent car. The cost of public utilities needed to facilitate bicycle traffic versus the price of an infrastructure tailored to high speeds is proportionately even less than the price differential of the vehicles used in the 2 systems. In the bicycle system, engineered roads are necessary only at certain points of dense traffic, and people who live far from the surfaced path are not thereby automatically isolated as they would be if they depended on cars or trains. The bicycle has extended man's radius without shunting him onto roads he cannot walk. Where he cannot ride his bike, he can usually push it. The bicycle also uses little space. 18 bikes can be parked in the place of 1 car, 30 of them can move along in the space devoured by a single automobile. It takes 3 lanes of a given size to move 40,000 people across a bridge in 1 hour by using automated trains, 4 to move them on buses, 12 to move them in their cars, and only 2 lanes for them to pedal across on bicycles. Of all these vehicles, only the bicycle really allows people to go from door to door without walking. The cyclist can reach new destinations of his choice without his tool creating new locations from which he is barred. Bicycles let people move with greater speed without taking up significant amounts of scarce space, energy, or time. They can spend fewer hours on each mile and still travel more miles in a year. They can get the benefit of technological breakthroughs without putting undue claims on the schedules, energy, or space of others. They become masters of their own movements without blocking those of their fellows. Their new tool creates only those demands which it can also satisfy. Every increase in motorized speed creates new demands on space and time. The use of the bicycle is self-limiting. It allows people to create a new relationship between their life space and their lifetime, between their territory and the pulse of their being, without destroying their inherited balance. The advantages of modern self-powered traffic are obvious, and ignored. That better traffic runs faster is asserted, but never proved. Before they ask people to pay for it, those who propose acceleration should try to display the evidence for their claim. A grisly contest between bicycles and motors is just coming to an end. In Vietnam, a hyper-industrialized army tried to conquer, but could not overcome, a people organized around bicycle speed. The lesson should be clear. High-energy armies can annihilate people, both those they defend and those against whom they are launched, but they are of very limited use to a people which defends itself. It remains to be seen if the Vietnamese will apply what they learned in war to an economy of peace, if they will be willing to protect the values that made their victory possible. The dismal likelihood is that the victors, for the sake of industrial progress and increased energy consumption, will tend to defeat themselves by destroying that structure of equity, rationality, and autonomy into which American bombers force them by depriving them of fuels, motors, and roads. Dominant versus subsidiary motors. People are born almost equally mobile. Their natural ability speaks for the personal liberty of each one to go wherever he or she wants to go. Citizens of a society founded on the notion of equity will demand the protection of this right against any abridgment. It should be irrelevant to them by what means the exercise of personal mobility is denied, whether by imprisonment, bondage to an estate, revocation of a passport, or enclosure within an environment that encroaches on a person's native ability to move in order to make him a consumer of transport. This inalienable right of free movement does not lapse just because most of our contemporaries have strapped themselves into ideological seatbelts. Man's natural capacity for transit emerges as the only yardstick by which to measure the contribution transport can make to traffic. There is only so much transport that traffic can bear. It remains to be outlined how we can distinguish those forms of transport that cripple the power to move from those that enhance it. Transportation can abridge traffic in 3 ways: by breaking its flow, by creating isolated sets of destinations, and by increasing the loss of time due to traffic. I have already argued that the key to the relation between transport and traffic is the speed of vehicles. I have described how, past a certain threshold of speed, transport has gone on to obstruct traffic in these 3 ways. It blocks mobility by cluttering up the environment with vehicles and roads. It transforms geography into a pyramid of circuits sealed off from one another according to levels of acceleration. It expropriates lifetime at the behest of speed. If beyond a certain threshold transport obstructs traffic, the inverse is also true. Below some level of speed, motorized vehicles can complement or improve traffic by permitting people to do things they could not do on foot or on bicycle. A well-developed transportation system running at top speeds of 25 miles per hour would have allowed Fix to chase Phileas Fogg around the world in less than half of 80 days. Motors can be used to transport the sick, the lame, the old, and the just plain lazy. Motor pulleys can lift people over hills, but they can do so peacefully only if they do not push the climber off the path. Trains can extend the range of travel, but can do so with justice only if people have not only equal transportation but equal free time to come closer to each other. The time engaged in travel must be, as much as possible, the traveler's own, only insofar as motorized transport remains limited to speeds which leave it subsidiary to autonomous transit can a traffic-optimal transportation system be developed. A limit on the power and therefore on the speed of motors does not by itself ensure those who are weaker against exploitation by the rich and powerful, who can still devise means to live and work at better located addresses, travel with retinue in plush carriages, and reserve a special lane for doctors and members of the Central Committee. But at a sufficiently limited maximum speed, this is an unfairness which can be reduced or even corrected by political means, by grassroots control over taxes, routes, vehicles, and their schedules in the community. At unlimited top speed, neither public ownership of the means of transportation nor technical improvements in their control can ever eliminate growing and unequal exploitation. A transportation industry is the key to optimal production of traffic, but only if it does not exercise its radical monopoly over that personal mobility which is intrinsically and primarily a value in use. Under-equipment, overdevelopment, and mature technology. The combination of transportation and transit that constitutes traffic has provided us with an example of socially optimal per capita wattage and of the need for politically chosen limits on it. But traffic can also be viewed as but one model for the convergence of worldwide development goals, and as a criterion by which to distinguish those countries that are lamely under-equipped from those that are destructively over-industrialized. A country can be classified as under-equipped if it cannot outfit each citizen with a bicycle or provide a 5-speed transmission as a bonus for anyone who wants to pedal others around. It is under-equipped if it cannot provide good roads for the cycle, or free motorized public transportation, though at bicycle speed, for those who want to travel for more than a few hours in succession. No technical, economic, or ecological reason exists why such backwardness should be tolerated anywhere in 1975. It would be a scandal if the natural mobility of a people were forced to stagnate on a pre-bicycle level against its will. A country can be classified as over-industrialized when its social life is dominated by the transportation industry, which has come to determine its class privileges, to accentuate its time scarcity, and to tie its people more tightly to the tracks it has laid out for them. Beyond under-equipment and over-industrialization, there is a place for the world of post-industrial effectiveness, where the industrial mode of production complements other autonomous forms of production. There is a place, in other words, for a world of technological maturity. In terms of traffic, it is the world of those who have tripled the extent of their daily horizon by lifting themselves onto their bicycles. It is just as much the world marked by a variety of subsidiary motors available for the occasions when a bicycle is not enough and when an extra push will limit neither equity nor freedom. And it is, too, the world of the long voyage, a world where every place is open to every person, at his own pleasure and speed, without haste or fear, by means of vehicles that cross distances without breaking with the earth which man walked for hundreds of thousands of years on his own 2 feet. Under-equipment keeps people frustrated by inefficient labor and invites the enslavement of man by man. Over-industrialization enslaves people to the tools they worship, fattens professional hierarchs on bits and on watts, and invites the translation of unequal power into huge income differentials. It imposes the same net transfers of power on the productive relations of every society, no matter what creed the managers profess, no matter what rain dance, what penitential ritual they conduct. Technological maturity permits a society to steer a course equally free of either enslavement. But beware, that course is not charted. Technological maturity permits a variety of political choices and cultures. The variety diminishes, of course, as a community allows industry to grow at the cost of autonomous production. Reasoning alone can offer no precise measure for the level of post-industrial effectiveness and technological maturity appropriate to a concrete society. It can only indicate in dimensional terms the range into which these technological characteristics must fit. It must be left to a historical community engaged in its own political process to decide when programming, space distortion, time scarcity, and inequality cease to be worth its while. Reasoning can identify speed as the critical factor in traffic. Reasoning combined with experimentation can identify the order of magnitude at which vehicular speed turns into a socio-political determinant. No genius, no expert, no club of elites can set limits to industrial outputs that will be politically feasible. The need for such limits as an alternative to disaster is the strongest argument in favor of radical technology. Only when the speed limits of vehicles reflect the enlightened self-interest of a political community can these limits become operative. Obviously, this interest cannot even be expressed in a society where one class monopolizes not only transportation but communication, medicine, education, and weapons as well. It does not matter if this power is held by legal owners or by entrenched managers of an industry that is legally owned by the workers. This power must be reappropriated and submitted to the sound judgment of the common man. The reconquest of power starts with the recognition that expert knowledge blinds the secretive bureaucrat to the obvious way of dissolving the energy crisis, just as it blinded him to the obvious solution to the war in Vietnam. There are 2 roads from where we are to technological maturity. One is the road of liberation from affluence, the other is the road of liberation from dependence. Both roads have the same destination, the social restructuring of space that offers to each person a constantly renewed experience that the center of the world is where he stands, walks, and lives. Liberation from affluence begins on the traffic islands where the rich run into one another. The wellsped are tossed from one island to the next and are offered but the company of fellow passengers en route to somewhere else. This solitude of plenty would begin to break down as the traffic islands gradually expanded and people began to recover their native power to move around the place where they lived. Thus, the impoverished environment of the traffic island could embody the beginnings of social reconstruction, and the people who now call themselves rich would break with bondage to over-efficient transport on the day they came to treasure the horizon of their traffic islands, now fully grown, and to dread frequent shipments from their homes. Liberation from dependence starts at the other end. It breaks the constraints of village and valley and leads beyond the boredom of narrow horizons and the stifling oppression of a world closed in on itself. To expand life beyond the radius of tradition without scattering it to the winds of acceleration is a goal that any poor country could achieve within a few years, but it is a goal that will be reached only by those who reject the offer of unchecked industrial development made in the name of an ideology of indefinite energy consumption. Liberation from the radical monopoly of the transportation industry is possible only through the institution of a political process that demystifies and disestablishes speed and limits traffic-related public expenditures of money, time, and space to the pursuit of equal mutual access. Such a process amounts to public guardianship over a means of production to keep this means from turning into a fetish for the majority and an end for the few. The political process, in turn, will never engage the support of a vast majority unless its goals are set with reference to a standard that can be publicly and operationally verified. The recognition of a socially critical threshold of the energy quantum incorporated in a commodity, such as a passenger mile, provides such a standard. A society that tolerates the transgression of this threshold inevitably diverts its resources from the production of means that can be shared equitably and transforms them into fuel for a sacrificial flame that victimizes the majority. On the other hand, a society that limits the top speed of its vehicles in accordance with this threshold fulfills a necessary, though by no means a sufficient, condition for the political pursuit of equity. Liberation which comes cheap to the poor will cost the rich dear, but they will pay its price once the acceleration of their transportation systems grinds traffic to a halt. A concrete analysis of traffic betrays the truth underlying the energy crisis. The impact of industrially packaged quanta of energy on the social environment tends to be degrading, exhausting, and enslaving, and these effects come into play even before those which threaten the pollution of the physical environment and the extinction of the race. The crucial point at which these effects can be reversed is not, however, a matter of deduction, but of decision. The social construction of energy. Opening talk to a seminar on the basic option within any future low-energy society held in El Colegio de México, Mexico, July 1983. By Ivan Illich. There is little in common between E when a physicist writes it and energy when the word is used by an economist, politician or windmill fan. E is an algorithm, energy is a loaded word. E is meaningful only within a formula, energy is charged with hidden implications, it refers to a subtle something which has the ability to make nature do work. Even the engineer who routinely handles megawatts talks of energy when he speaks to his client. Energy now, as work formerly, has become something which individuals and societies need. It is a symbol that fits our age, the symbol of that which is both abundant and scarce. The theoretical notion and the social construct were born as Siamese twins. By the end of the 19th century, aged barely 50, they had become antagonistic lookalikes. E had matured in the hothouse of labs. Each new trick he learned to play, each new twist it was taught, has been carefully monitored. In the course of its history, E has embedded into its own theory the rules by which the symbol may be used. In Einstein's words, it became part of the theory which decides what the physicist sees. Energy in the meantime rose to the throne of the Almighty, and became the metaphor for what is now called basic needs. E became abstract, beyond imagination. Energy became both mysterious and trivial, beyond examination and seemingly unworthy of it. Today the twin-born determine two types of discourse, so strange that they just barely translate into each other. I do not want to add to the knowledge about E. I am also not dealing here with free and bound energy, that is, sexuality and Sigmund Freud. This theme I take up in a separate essay. Nor do I want to comment here on the attempts to interpret the working of the social order in terms of thermodynamics, as Georgescu Rogan has done. Further, I do not deal with those historians who have tried to complement economic history with historical energetics, with Ostwald at the turn of the century, Leslie White towards its middle and many energy mystics today, for whom progress reflects society's ability to appropriate energy. The interpretation of economics as a special case of thermodynamics, the interpretation of society as a system of self-regulating energy exchanges, or the attempt to interpret social evolution as increased social control over energy flows, all these I consider seductive but limping analogies. My reason for dealing with the history of energy is different from all these. I discover in the emergence of this verbal symbol the means by which nature has been interpreted as a domain governed by the assumption of scarcity, and thus human beings could be redefined as nature's ever-needy clients. Once the universe itself is placed under the regime of scarcity, Homo is no longer born under the stars but under the axioms of economics. To get at the matter I must review briefly the core meanings of energy, how it was transmogrified from human vigor to nature's capital. In Greek, the word energy is both frequent and strong. It might best be rendered in English as being on the make, with all the shades this expression carries. In its Latin version, in actu, the term is of central importance in medieval philosophy, meaning form, perfection, act, in contrast to mere possibility. In ordinary English, the word first appears in the 16th century. For Elizabethans, energy means the vigor of an utterance, the force of an expression, always the quality of a personal presence. 100 years later the word can qualify an impersonal impact, the power of an argument or the ability of church music to generate an effect in the soul. The term is still used exclusively for psychic effects, although only for those engendered by either a person or a thing. During the 17th century, the attempt got underway to quantify nature's forces. Leibniz spoke of a magnitude that remains intact whatever happens, like money when it is changed. In the 18th century, the vis viva, life force of the universe became a quantity of motion, an important concept of natural philosophers. Collisions, springs, rolling balls were observed, and each language in Europe was enriched by several words to designate the different kinds of power or efficacy passed on, and variously expressed as MV, M.V2, half M.V2. This vis was renamed by Thomas Young and called energy. In 1807, he wrote that energy may be applied with great property to the mass or the weight of a body into the square number expressing its velocity. Paradoxically, the term energy, used for the preceding 300 years to designate the forcefulness of a face or the liveliness of a statement was first used to designate the force of nature precisely at the time when, in all the natural sciences, nature's vitality, its Lebenskraft, was being systematically denied. Young's usage, however, did not gain acceptance. It took another 40 years before energy entered the terminology of physics, and then, in opposition to Young, to designate a something in contrast to a force. Energy is distinguished in modern physics from force as the integral from its function. Only through this distinction did energy come into its own. It had never been attributed to nature, as long as nature was spoken of as mother. By 1844, nature, in Liebig's words, had become the one matrix of distinct forces such as electricity, heat, light, and magnetism that could be measured in units of work. This shift of language is uncannily close to a shift of language in obstetrics. Until the early 18th century, it was women who bore children, and women who were delivered of them by women. After 1820, it is a bioengineer, the gynecologist, who delivers the child from the matrix, and the child grows up into the workforce. During the first half of the 19th century, physics construed something akin to the division of labor. Value equivalents between heat, electricity and mechanical movements were measured. One Englishman boiled water by drilling a cannon and related the amount of steam pressure produced in the effort made by the horse turning the drill. Another one got heat by rubbing two blocks of ice against each other, and reported the amount of water obtained and the effort expended. The search for something like a gold standard in nature thus led to a new kind of experimental metaphysics, to laboratory proofs of entities that cannot be observed. The objective existence of something which just changes its form in ever more precisely observed and measured appearances became itself the new scientific mythology. Though no one, of course, observed it, and for a decade there was no agreement on the term which should name it, Julius Robert von Meyer, 1842, Hermann von Helmholtz, 1847, William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, and several others, working independently from each other, define this something as nature's ability to perform work. Work in these 5 years from 1842 to 1847 became a physical magnitude, and energy its sources. Work was defined as the production of a physical change, and energy was assumed as its metaphysical cause. It might be important to recall that during the second quarter of the 19th century the same scientific myth found its expression in three images: the womb became the source of life, the universe the source of energy, and the population a source of labor force. I here focus on the parallel traits of the second and third. As Arbeitskraft was imputed to human activity insofar as it is productive in the economy, energy was imputed to nature insofar as it produces work. Through the imputation of energy, nature was recast in the image of the newly constituted human as worker. Nature, now understood as the depository and matrix of a workforce called energy, mirrored the proletariat, the matrix of available labor force. and the steam engine lurked behind all reality. The artifact that could serve as unifying symbol had been the clock, under the absolute rulers of the 16th and 17th centuries. With its automata dancing at the hour in a cosmic theater of spheres, the ruler's clock was not primarily a means to measure time. It was the spectacle of rational harmony in medicine, pageantry and state. It demonstrated central authority in the cosmos over bodies, planets and subjects. But a clock's wheels that had neither liberty nor autonomy became abhorrent to the political and religious Protestants, especially in late 17th century England. The self-regulating machine became the symbol of constitutional monarchy, the image of a new order based on countervailing forces in the dynamic balance of supply and demand. However, these Cartesian machines were not meant to work. The new machine which drives the thermodynamic age is meant to work. It symbolizes the age of production, of input and output. Henceforth nature, the womb, population, and even the clock of old, are perceived as devices that work. The steam engine first, then the dynamo which, invented by Faraday in 1831, was by accident inverted at the Vienna Exposition of 1873 and became the electric motor. Finally, the moving internal combustion plant completed the third successive stage of the modern world which works. In 1827, Joule was looking for a word to designate the unit of work done by a unit of fuel. He picked the word duty as the measure of a machine's efficiency. The reduction of duty to the performance of productive work for men and reproduction for women, so characteristic for the second quarter of the 19th century, thus also embraced the machine. By the end of this short span, the whole of so-called world history is nothing more than the production of man through human work, to quote Marx, Die Eigung des Menschen durch die menschliche Arbeit. The simultaneous invention of these two distinct potentials for work, energy and labor power, deserves to be explored. This, however, makes it necessary to return to the history of E to avoid any confusion of it with energy. In 1872, the first attempt was undertaken by Mach to write the history of the principle of conservation formulated fully 25 years earlier by Helmholtz. Mach did not write on the conservation of energy, but on the conservation of Arbeit, which is work. The first to undertake explicitly a history of E was Max Planck, at the age of 26. He tried to exclude all hypotheses about the constitution of nature or of heat, any reference to the movement of corpuscles or imponderable fluids. He was concerned with the measurement of nature's manifestations in work, and the history of the corresponding accounting system. With his paper, Planck tried and failed to win the first prize at a competition at the Philosophical Faculty of Göttingen in 1884. It was obvious for Planck that the concept of energy, which he wanted to study in its historical evolution, derived all its meaning in physics from the principle of conservation of energy as the idea, that it is impossible to get work done without compensation. Die Leistung von Arbeit kann nicht, ohne irgendeine Kompensation erfolgen. Planck shows that the idea had been conceived and formulated in the mid-1840s, and that by the 60s there was no more doubt about its validity. I have not found in this early paper of Max Planck even the slightest suspicion that the language used about the principles of physics was decidedly sociogenetic. However, at the same time, Mach had already begun to pry apart energy from E, and had thus taken the necessary steps for the divorce which meant the end of 50 years of classical thermodynamics. For Mach, it is inadmissible to postulate something like a workforce behind observed phenomena, unless the scientist is able to verify its existence by direct experiment. Mach did not deny the convenience of such a hypothesis, he only requested that the person using it be aware that what he uses is a supposition. The choice of one among several applicable hypotheses, according to Mach, should be made entirely on the grounds of the elegance with which such a concept, as, for instance, energy, fits into the formulas that connect observed events. His controversy with H.R. Hertz made this clear. Hertz had described the transverse wave nature of electromagnetic action through space, in which he was left out. Mach objected to this, not because he found fault with Hertz's demonstration, but because using E would have allowed a more elegant statement. Einstein, throughout his life, was unambiguous about entities like E. They cannot be derived from experience by logic but must be understood as free creations of the human spirit. By the beginning of the century, E was recognized by those who used it as such a construct to designate the state of a field. Kantians interpreted it as the physical formulation of the principle of causality. Poincaré reduced it to a mere tautology. By 1920, the few who still reached for a metamathematical interpretation of the E explained it as the consequence of a symmetry within fields or as a characteristic of the homogeneity of time, something which in relativity and quantum mechanics plays a role faintly reminiscent of the golden rule in Greek architecture, the logos. To keep as sober as Mach or Einstein was not easy as theoretical modern physics acquired prestige. People left outside the charmed circle around E looked towards the academic alchemists as the source of ultimate riches or as initiates into ultimate mystique. Not a few physicists began to pander to the public. Energy was presented as the sole attribute of ultimate reality. Under the name of energetism, F. Paulson, 1892, had already developed the idea that ethics, much more than mathematics, had to be understood as the other side of physics. Both dealt with the perfection of being through its activity, its work. The outstanding representative of the new energetics was, of course, Wilhelm Ostwald. Nobel Prize laureate in 1908, editor of one of the most prestigious scientific journals, publisher of 230 volumes of scientific classics, creator of the logarithmic classification of colors, this man dedicated his main work to Mach. In several major books, he presented energy as the only real substance, the common substrate of body and soul. He applied the second principle of thermodynamics to economics and ethics. All life is a competition for free energy, whose accessible quantity is always in scarce supply. 1913. Valuation, choice and action, das Wollen, more precisely, willing, can be reduced to energetic terms encompassing material and spiritual reality. From 1883, Ostwald published his Sunday sermons. Later he became the president of the World Monist Association. What in Ostwald sounds like the lucubrations of a physicist turned quasi-philosopher had lost its news value by World War II. Without the need to make much ado about it, Heisenberg formulates the same convictions in his Gifford Lectures of 1956 in the form of a creed: the substance out of which all elementary particles and all things are made, that which causes change, and changes, but is never lost, that which can be transformed into movement, heat, light, tension, that is energy. As he became esoteric, an increasing number of physicists came to act as gurus who popularized its real nature. Once famous physicists had lent their prestige to the interpretation of energy as nature's ultimate capital. The principle of the conservation of energy became the cosmological confirmation of the postulate of scarcity. The principle of contradiction was operationalized. It was restated in the formula that you can't get a free lunch. By a cosmic extension of the assumption of scarcity, the world visible and invisible was turned into a zero-sum game, as if Jehovah, with a Big Bang, had created Das Kapital. Both 19th-century energetism, that tried to reduce value to energy, and 20th-century energetic monism, still with us in the exoteric Heisenberg, adhere to the myth that science was a rational undertaking. This changed with F. Capper's Tao of Physics, 1975. The discovery of energy now reflects an evolution of human consciousness, E. Jans, The Evolutionary Vision, 1981, and the recovery of mystical experience as a superior form of knowledge, M. Talbot, Mysticism in the New Physics, 1981. In this view, the cosmology of modern physics converges with old Oriental intuitions in China, G. Zhukov, The Dancing Woolly Masters, 1979, and Advaita Vedanta, R. H. Jones, Mysticism and Science, 1980. The alchemists are perhaps turning into theologians. And the theology of energy is as alien to my precise concern as the mathematics of E. I am interested not in the theology but in the superstitions about energy. This first seminar on the social construction of energy is being held at the Colegio de Mexico, and this has for me a special significance. The library of this institution holds an immense deposit of Latin American superstitions. In 30 years of labor, I have helped to assemble this stuff. Superstitious religiosity has been for 3 decades my hobby, neither theology, nor just any popular religiosity, but superstition. I learned from Chris Rittenbeck to call superstition the popular beliefs and forms of behavior which come into existence under the aegis, whose accessible quantity is always in scarce supply, 1913. Valuation, choice and action, das Wollen, more precisely, willing, can be reduced to energetic terms encompassing material and spiritual reality. From 1883, Ostwald published his Sunday sermons. Later he became the president of the World Monist Association. What in Ostwald sounds like the lucubrations of a physicist turned quasi-philosopher had lost its news value by World War II. Without the need to make much ado about it, Heisenberg formulates the same convictions in his Gifford Lectures of 1956 in the form of a creed: the substance out of which all elementary particles and all things are made, that which causes change, and changes, but is never lost, that which can be transformed into movement, heat, light, tension, that is energy. As he became esoteric, an increasing number of physicists came to act as gurus who popularized its real nature. Once famous physicists had lent their prestige to the interpretation of energy as nature's ultimate capital. The principle of the conservation of energy became the cosmological confirmation of the postulate of scarcity. The principle of contradiction was operationalized. It was restated in the formula that you can't get a free lunch. By a cosmic extension of the assumption of scarcity, the world visible and invisible was turned into a zero-sum game, as if Jehovah, with a Big Bang, had created Das Kapital. Both 19th-century energetism, that tried to reduce value to energy, and 20th-century energetic monism, still with us in the exoteric Heisenberg, adhere to the myth that science was a rational undertaking. This changed with F. Capper's Tao of Physics, 1975. The discovery of energy now reflects an evolution of human consciousness, E. Jans, The Evolutionary Vision, 1981, and the recovery of mystical experience as a superior form of knowledge, M. Talbot, Mysticism in the New Physics, 1981. In this view, the cosmology of modern physics converges with old Oriental intuitions in China, G. Zhukov, The Dancing Woolly Masters 1979, and Advaita Vedanta, R. H. Jones, Mysticism and Science 1980. The alchemists are perhaps turning into theologians. And the theology of energy is as alien to my precise concern as the mathematics of E. I am interested not in the theology but in the superstitions about energy. This first seminar on the social construction of energy is being held at the Colegio de Mexico, and this has for me a special significance. The library of this institution holds an immense deposit of Latin American superstitions. In 30 years of labor, I have helped to assemble this stuff. Superstitious religiosity has been for 3 decades my hobby, neither theology, nor just any popular religiosity, but superstition. I learned from Chris Rittenbeck to call superstition the popular beliefs and forms of behavior which come into existence under the aegis, the Adam Smith. For Smith, the labor force, work in the abstract, became the true measure of the exchange value of all goods. Now, labor had become something which could be measured as an aggregate. The annual labor of every nation is the fund which originally supplies it with all necessaries and conveniences of life. Wealth of Nations, 1776. Profit and rent constitute a deduction from values created by labor alone was an idea of Smith on which Ricardo elaborated to distinguish the forms of labor: live work, freely available from people, and past labor bound up as capital which could be put to work. By 1821 Ricardo recognized that capital, in the form of machinery, could replace live labor and thus become injurious to the working class. He elaborated a cost theory of value. With the reversible equivalence between the two forms of labor he remained within the field of the observable. It never occurred to him to connect profit to the expropriation of value which is drawn from a meta-economical sphere. Political economy inquires into the matrix from which value flows. The step from Ricardo to Marx can be compared to the step from Sadi Carnot to Helmholtz. Carnot in 1824 examined the moving power of fire. He established a set of equations that show how steam engines work. His equations still hold. The validity of his demonstration depends exclusively on what he had observed, temperature differentials and work performance. With Helmholtz, we get an explanation of why steam drives the piston. Work is the result of the transfer of energy from coal to wheel, and that is the way late 20th century textbooks still define it. In economics, Ricardo, a contemporary of Sadi Carnot's, valued work at the price paid for the worker's time. 20 years later, as Helmholtz worked on his epoch-making paper, young Marx traced the source of economic value. He developed the theory that explains how the employer can appropriate the surplus value of labor. For Marx, the economy runs on the positive difference between the total labor time used in production and that part of it that covers the cost of the reproduction of the workforce. For Smith and Ricardo, what the worker sold was his service, his concrete work. In Marx, he sells his labor power, his Arbeitkraft, part of which is expropriated by the capitalist. The parallel between the potential to work possessed by nature and by the proletariat can be further developed. When the engineer taps energy, this energy produces two things: work and random heat, chaos, which latter Clausius called entropy. Something analogous happens when the capitalist taps labor power, which produces two things: surplus value for him and the income to the worker that goes up in untidy reproduction. Thus, the population saw itself reduced to the matrix of a labor force, and nature was reduced to be the matrix of energy. Gynecologists redefined women as those human beings whose very nature has destined them to the reproduction of new life. However, political economy soon became as irrelevant to economics as energetics to physics. The two might use the same terms, but with different meanings. The labor force that appears in a socialist manpower report means the same that it means in a report from the World Bank. But just as monist professors of physics preached vulgar energetics, Marxist economists love to pontificate on the labor theory of value. quite independently from their meanings in science and structured ideologies. The two words work and energy became key words of contemporary language. Both became strong persuasive words which give a moral and social interpretation to the sentence in which they occur. That work acts as such a key word has been recognized. The right to work, the dignity of work, a workers' republic, labor and, especially, unemployment carry direct and strong ethical connotations. We are aware of their recent origin and their distinctiveness is unique for the different epochs we can remember. This has not been so for energy. It has been overlooked.